All right. Good luck, have fun, and have fun. Yeah, it's been a trolly weekend in terms of chat. Today has been it's the hobby troll. Yesterday was the appearance attack troll. You're ugly. Your face looks stupid. It was that type of people. And today it's been the way that you spend your time is not good. That's it. Alright, so we got the Agent Smith chat. Hopping it in. What's up?
Hello?
That is the Agent Smith. Hey, dude.
Oh, hey, how are you?
Oh, solid. It's been a pretty interesting week. Mostly good, I would say. How's yours been?
Oh, pretty quiet, as usual.
That's good. Keeping it real, keeping it chill. Staying safe when the world's being all wild and stuff. I heard that there was a rumbly bumbly in North Korea this morning. A bunch of people were like, is this an earthquake or is it a new missile test?
Yeah, they tested another nuclear weapon, it looks like. That's the assertion, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It's several orders of magnitude more powerful than the last nuclear weapon that they ostensibly tested. So it kind of adds to this impression that their nuclear program is kind of really progressing along very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's on top of a ballistic missile test that they had a couple days ago, in which they fired a missile over Japan through their airspace.
Yeah, I saw some highlights of Japanese TV of people getting the alert for the missile and some of them seeing it go over, I think.
Yeah, it's they don't do it very often. They've done it twice before, but before they had said they had a nominal excuse, which is that it was actually a satellite, not a missile, or at least not a ballistic missile. But this time they came out and said explicitly that yes, it's a ballistic missile, and we just shot it through your airspace, so suck on that. Yeah, supposedly they're saying that it could be a, well, not the North Koreans, but I've read that it could be a thermonuclear bomb, a hydrogen bomb instead of just an atomic bomb that they tested, which might be why it's so much more powerful,
So,
which would be disconcerting.
if they were testing that, what are they blowing it up on? Just in a big empty area?
Oh, they blow it up underground.
Oh.
Yeah, that's how people detected it. It gave off what are they? Seismic waves, I guess.
Mhm.
And people who observed those picked up on it. And apparently, it gives off. It's very distinguishable.
Mhm.
It's kind of distinguishable from, say, a regular earthquake. And so analysts were pretty quick to pick up on that and say that it had been another test.
Mhm. Yeah, I think with the regular earthquake, you have the friction between two tectonic plates, and you have multiple waves of seismic activity, whereas this would be more of one just really big kaboom.
Yeah, I think that is what distinguishes it. Because earthquakes generally affect a broader area. Yeah, I don't think the test is really a substantive change.
Mm-hmm.
Just in terms of the status of relations between North Korea and the United States, among other countries. So, more of the same there. I still don't think that they'll ever actually use it. The only way I see them using a nuclear weapon in an aggressive manner would be something happens with regard to internal North Korean politics. Something happens in the regime, some uprising or attempt to overthrow the government, or rival factions put pressure on Kim Jong-un, and then there's a feeling that he has to do something to prove that he's a tough leader. And so the idea would be, okay, if we use a nuclear weapon in a test or something like that, then maybe I could preserve my rule, which is under attack from these other factions. And then the risk there is that he ends up doing something so aggressive, or something that he thinks is only slightly aggressive, but that ends up triggering the United States government or the South Korean government, and that inadvertently causes a conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So some bad game theory, basically. If that could play out, there could be a miscalculation in terms of one side or the other doing something that it doesn't think would cause a war. That's an attempt at a signal that inadvertently does cause a conflict.
Yeah.
Given how unpredictable Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump are, there's kind of an elevated risk of that happening, and that's kind of the biggest risk going forward. And that's much more that's of much more concern than any of these tests that they've been doing. Yeah, international relations tends to be pretty stable when countries have nuclear weapons, somewhat counterintuitively, because of mutually assured destruction.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a sense that I've even heard it argued that more countries should have nuclear weapons, just to prevent more conflicts from breaking out, because countries would be too afraid to do it. But of course, that argument assumes a lot of rationality on the part of the countries and the leadership of the countries that would have those nuclear weapons, and that's not always a safe assumption. So that's probably not going to happen, at least as far as policy goes in the United States. I don't think anybody wants to see proliferation on a wide scale.
Yep. Yeah, like you're saying, what if you're dealing with irrational actors?
Yeah, unfortunately, that does happen. And you actually kind of saw that in World War II, because after World War I, it was thought that another world war would be virtually impossible, because nobody would be crazy enough to want that after all the destruction from the First World War. And that was one of the reasons why people were willing to appease Hitler in Germany in the early going. They didn't think that his threats had credibility, given that nobody thought anybody would want to risk another world war. And so Hitler didn't want a war either. He just thought he could basically take over Europe without a fight, because everybody was just giving him what he wanted anyway, on account of appeasement. And so his calculation was, okay, if I pick off the western half of Poland and give the other half to the Soviets, they'll just do nothing, so it won't be a problem. And then, of course, by that point, it had already happened several times, and so the West thought it had to retaliate, and so inadvertently a conflict broke out. And so after that, there was, after everybody had thought the Second World War was so unlikely, and then it happened anyway, nobody really had any confidence that a Third World War was unthinkable. It was just assumed to be inevitable. And there was a lot of sort of despair on that account.
Mm-hmm.
Although, to be fair, nuclear weapons were not as powerful in the early going of the Cold War as they were later, so that wasn't as mutually assured destruction rather was it had been bandied around as an idea from the start of the Cold War, but the idea of an apocalyptic nuclear exchange was something that came more in the late 50s, early 60s. So for the first 15 some years, it was not thought to be as it was not thought that a Third World War would be as destructive as people later on think of it. Certainly as much as people now think of it. And that's partly because of thermonuclear weapons. Atomic weapons are much less powerful than thermonuclear weapons, and also delivery vehicles were less efficient then. It's a lot harder to get a bomber with a nuclear weapon through a set of air defenses than it is a ballistic missile, which is very difficult to shoot down. Mm-hmm. So early going in the Cold War, it was almost all bombers. It was just assumed that would be the principal mode of delivery. And I don't think the Soviets even had a means of delivering a nuclear weapon to targets in the United States until the early mid-1950s. And that was when they had developed the Tupolev 95 Bear, I think it was called, which was their first intercontinental bomber, their sort of equivalent to the B-52. Before that, their longest-range bomber had been the Tupolev 16. I think the NATO code name for that was Badger, and if I'm remembering this correctly, the Badger did not actually have the range, even on a one-way mission, to make it to the United States. which didn't stop, the intelligence agencies in the United States and the West kind of assumed they did, and that was a source of a lot of consternation. But in point of fact, the Soviets were kind of bluffing on that count. They pretty regularly bluffed early on in the Cold War, and they actually had a much weaker position in terms of military strength. That was one of the reasons the Cuban Missile Crisis played out the way it did, rather. The Soviets did not have a lot of intercontinental ballistic missiles, that is to say, ballistic missiles with the range to hit the United States. They had bombers, but again, bombers are easier to shoot down. The United States, in contrast, had a whole shit ton of intercontinental ICBMs by that point, so there was a big missile gap in favor of the United States in terms of missile power, and that gave the United States some leverage. And as a result, the Soviets were a little more willing to negotiate as far as removing missiles from Cuba than they would be otherwise. Because if there had been a nuclear exchange at that point, they would have gotten the worst of it. Yeah, thermonuclear weapons are just so much more powerful than atomic weapons. There was a discussion in the early 50s about whether or not it was even wise to develop them. And I think Oppenheimer, who was the head of the nuclear program at that point in the United States, advocated against it. He didn't see any sense in building weapons that powerful, given how powerful atomic weapons already were. But there was this Hungarian scientist, I don't remember his name, who advocated for them, and he ended up winning the argument. And so H-bomb research went forward, and basically the United States and later the Soviets, who kind of developed them and deployed them a bit later, both ended up building these huge arsenals that could destroy the whole world if they were so inclined.
Have nukes gotten that much stronger since Cold War?
Have what?
Nukes gotten much stronger since the Cold War, like after that.
Well, I was actually reading about that recently, because we talked before about MIRVs, right, the multiple independent reentry vehicles, and how there's multiple nuclear warheads in every ballistic missile. It's not just one warhead per missile. I was reading more about that, and I actually found that the missile warheads are kind of going down in yield, and partly on purpose. And what I read is that what they've decided to do, I think starting in the 70s or 80s from what I read, was that instead of having the multiple warheads in each missile target different cities, so that you have one missile destroying different targets, they would actually target all of the reentry vehicles on one city, but then have the yield on each warhead be relatively small. So the idea was that they would blow up particular parts of the city, presumably military targets and political targets. And I think the idea was to have minimize collateral damage, which is kind of a weird argument. I mean, you're hitting a city with multiple 100+ kiloton nuclear weapons. It's not really a surgical weapon, but that seems to be the kind of thinking behind that logic. Let's see. So we had some questions. Agent Smith talked before about the U.S.-North Korea conflict being perpetual, empty threats, yet they are clearly manufacturing and advancing their weapons. Is there any clear point at which the UN/other governments could intervene without going to war before North Korea attacks anyone? I don't think the UN or anyone else is going to move in on North Korea unless North Korea attacks first. I think short of that, there's not really any clear point, as you put it, wherein the UN or the US would, initiate hostilities, do something about it. Because, again, if North Korea has a nuclear weapon, it's probably not going to be an offensive weapon. It's almost certainly going to be a deterrent. It's a defensive weapon that they'll threaten people with if they feel threatened, but it's not something that they would start a conflict with. Because again, and this has been said in media multiple times, if North Korea starts a conflict, even if it's a nuclear conflict, then they get eradicated. Especially if they hit the United States. Doctrine in the United States, military doctrine, and I think this is still accurate, is that if there is an attack on the United States, even if it's a conventional attack, I think, then the response is a nuclear retaliation. And so any attempt by North Korea to use its nuclear weapons to initiate a conflict would result in the eradication of North Korea, not just the political regime, but probably the country in general. So that's not a conflict they would win. And I think right now the assumption anyway is the wide consensus seems to be that the North Korean leadership is rational, that they're not going to go crazy. And I think a lot of the reason people think they're crazy is because of the nature of the rhetoric, which is very aggressive and hostile, but for them that's normal. I mean, even within North Korea, the way the discourse in domestic politics is carried out on the part of the Communist Party there, that's pretty standard rhetoric. They almost always talk like that when it comes to politics. So it's not that unusual for them.
I was thinking about an analogy for that in terms of dogs. North Korea is kind of like the little tiny yippy dog that's constantly doing that shrieking bark, just being noisy as hell, but if it were to come to terms, they're pretty much at the bottom of the food chain. Like, North Korea's economy is very close to zero. There was a map released recently that was countries of the world who had a GDP greater than the US military budget. And North Korea didn't make the cut. So the entire GDP of the country doesn't match our military spending. They can't win, but they can be very loud. They can be very loud about what they do have, and kind of like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, they can bluff a whole bunch. They'll just bluff and bluff and bluff and be shouting constantly. And people get concerned because other countries don't really do that to the same extent. Like, threaten to just attack. We're going to go to war with them. We're going to shoot huge bombs at them. No one else does that right now. So they're the little yippy dog on the block that even the medium dogs would be able to beat North Korea if they had to.
Yeah, well, the weaker a country you are, then the more you have to use tactics like that, the more you have to appear more dangerous in order to deter any attempt by anybody to do anything to upset you. Like intervening in your politics or some kind of first strike against your nuclear arsenal, something to that effect. The weaker you are, the more you need to make clear that you're dangerous, if not crazy. So that kind of rhetoric stems from that game theory. It comes more from weakness than it does from strength. It's kind of like in, somebody with medieval history would probably know more about this than I would, but I remember reading at one point that a lot of medieval torture, such as it was, it wasn't really as common as people kind of think it was, but in so much as there was medieval torture used as punishment by medieval governments, it was done more because there was a lack of ability to enforce law. There was a lack of state capacity to enforce the government's writ. And so, as a result, in order to have a larger deterrent effect on the few people they were able to capture and punish, they made the punishments much more egregious and terrible in order to have fear, to instill fear in people, to try and deter them from committing crimes, because everybody knew it was relatively unlikely they would get caught, because again, weak states. But in order to make up for that shortfall in capacity, they tried to use fear to make up for it. So similarly, North Korea is kind of trying to use fear in order to make up for the fact that it lacks the capacity to actually threaten anybody in a tangible sense. So there was another question here about Russia seems to be oddly quiet on this particular issue, while China broke form and finally took a direct stance on the current state of international relations. What does this foreshadow for the future of relations between the US and Russia plus China? Yeah, China came out and said that if North Korea attacked first, then they weren't going to bail them out, which is another really good reason that North Korea will almost certainly not attack first with a nuclear weapon or otherwise. Without China to back them up, they really lose any hope that they could have of surviving a conflict. North Korea, almost very nearly lost the Korean War. The UN forces were almost literally on the border of North Korea and China before the Chinese intervened. So Chinese intervention is easily their trump card. It kind of makes them a little over-reliant on the Chinese in that regard. I think that's another reason they want a nuclear weapon. I think we talked a little bit about that last week. And Russia, I don't think Russia is oddly quiet. I think they're quiet because they don't have a lot of direct interest in this. North Korea is relevant to China because China wants to use North Korea as a buffer state between South Korea, which is an American ally, and Chinese territory. And of course, the United States has a direct interest because it guarantees the security of South Korea. But Russia, they don't have to care. They're not involved in that one way or the other. So for them, this is they're only worried about it in so much as they don't want a nuclear conflict to break out on their border. Russia does have a border with North Korea, albeit a small one. And so, in that sense, they have a general interest in security in the region. But beyond that, without any direct interest or a lot of capacity to do anything, they've kind of stayed on the sidelines. As far as what it foreshadows for the future in terms of U.S. relations with Russia and China, I don't think it really means much. I don't think it indicates any substantive change in the status quo there. I don't think Russia wants to use, for example, I don't think Russia wants to use the North Korea issue as leverage, diplomatic leverage, in order to gain concessions in other areas. I don't think they would start supporting North Korea to try to get the West to give concessions in terms of Syria or the Ukraine. I don't think they have that much interest in buddying up with the North Korean government. So no change there. And then the Chinese, for their part, I don't think their stance that they wouldn't help North Korea if they attacked first is that shocking. It helps that they clarify that. That sends a signal in and of itself, just the timing of the announcement that they're against the North Korean nuclear program. But beyond that, I don't think it signals a significant change in terms of their position or in terms of their relations with the United States. So status quo, basically, would be my answer. I don't think it foreshadows any change to the status quo. Somebody asked, how mobile is the Russian army in relation to crossing Siberia? I don't know. I would have to read more about it. I don't think the Trans-Siberian Railway is a very fast way to transport a large body of troops. It's relatively fast, but in modern warfare, things happen so quickly that traveling by rail isn't really ideal. It's much better to try to have people in place near where the conflict would break out before it starts, so that you don't have to move large amounts of troops over large distances. The Chinese actually are trying to shift away from it, because right now the Chinese army is very, very reliant on rail for transporting their army, transporting troops from one area to the next. So they're actually trying to shift away from that themselves. I'm sure if they had to, they could move a pretty decent number of troops pretty quickly, because the Russian government has been investing pretty heavily over the past 10 years in modernization. And I think we've talked a little bit before about how important logistics is to a military. It's easily one of the most critical functions that an army has to carry out, because everything is built on logistics. You can't do anything if you don't have any supplies. So everything is built on that. And their logistics train is not quite there. But they've been investing in that a lot as part of their modernization program. Specifically, things like cargo planes. Cargo planes are really important for projecting force, because it allows you to do exactly that, to move large numbers of troops quickly and keep them supplied. So they've added to that capacity over the past 10 years, which has probably improved their ability to move significant numbers of troops from, say, the Ural Mountain region or Central Asia into Siberia, or rather the Far East. I imagine when you say Siberia, you're really referring to the Russian Far East, because Siberia is actually a really large region, and the western part of Siberia is actually pretty close to the European part of Russia, west of the Ural Mountain range. It wouldn't be very hard at all to move a large number of troops into western Siberia, because it's right there. But once you get into the farther reaches of Siberia, that becomes a lot more difficult. So that's not a great answer, but that's what I've got off the top of my head. I'd have to read more about it to give you something more specific than that. Let's see.
Well, with the improvement in like air technology over the past several decades, it seems like ground troops wouldn't really be as big of a factor if two world powers were fighting against each other.
Sorry, what?
You're thinking about transferring infantry from one part of the country to another. If you're trying to do really big damage or whatever, it seems like air units would be a lot more important than they were in previous conflicts, just because how fast they can go and deliver damage.
Yeah, air power is very, very important in modern warfare, especially for the United States. The United States has invested heavily in ensuring air dominance in any given conflict. It's part of just its doctrine, even. So, for example, in any given intervention overseas, like the Gulf War, the first Gulf War anyway, and the second Gulf War, or one of the interventions in the Balkans in the 90s, the first part of any given deployment has almost always been reducing the air defenses of the target nation. And that's to facilitate that air superiority that is considered necessary for the United States to carry out military operations. So yeah, air power definitely plays a critical role, especially in terms of helping partner nations in places like Afghanistan now and Iraq, where the United States doesn't really want to deploy large numbers of ground troops anymore. They've made up the shortfall by basically acting as the Air Force for the Afghan or Iraqi army. And in that capacity, they've helped significantly. That's a pretty important role, and it's basically act as a very significant force multiplier for Allied troops operating against the Taliban or Islamic State or what have you. So it's definitely a key aspect. Yeah, the United States has relied so heavily on air superiority and the assumption thereof since World War II, I think, that it never developed really a significant surface-to-air missile system or a family of surface-to-air missile systems. The Russians, for example, have a whole shit ton. You know, they have a whole bunch of short-range, medium-range, long-range surface-to-air missile systems, and they have, you know, they add them on vehicles and just any kind of surface-to-air missile system you can think of, they've developed. And so they've got a whole range of products there that they manufacture. The United States, in contrast, hasn't invested nearly as much in surface-to-air missile capabilities. And the reason for that is specifically because the United States just plans on establishing air superiority, on destroying the ability, suppressing, as they say, suppressing air defenses sufficiently that they'll just have control of the sky. And will also, fighters, you know, air-to-air combat, they'll just establish air superiority by shooting down the other, well, whoever the opponent is, their air force with aircraft and suppressing air defenses. You know, regarding logistics, kind of going back to that a little bit, the United States, for a long time, basically throughout the Cold War, had a plan in place for how it would get its military from the United States to Europe. Obviously, there was a large standing army in Europe, along with the corresponding air and naval element, but the United States did not deploy a huge force in Europe. It was not as big as was thought would be needed in the event of World War III. You know, a good chunk of the force that it was thought would be needed came in the form of reserves, reserve forces, and National Guard units. And so in the event of a conflict in Europe, there was a plan in place to, as rapidly as possible, transport a large volume of National Guard and reserve units from the United States, where they would have to muster, you know, that is mobilize, be equipped, and then put on basically this transportation track, on this path to transport into Europe. And the ideal was to do that, I think, over the course of a couple days or a week or so, if I'm remembering this right. And but that was never tested because World War III never broke out. But then in Kuwait, in the first Gulf War, there was actually a need to mobilize quickly and get large numbers of troops over there. into Kuwait into Saudi Arabia more accurately, in preparation for the invasion of Kuwait, the liberation of Kuwait. And so something like this plan was actually practiced, and it didn't end up working well at all. From what I read about it, it was kind of a fiasco, and it ended up taking several months to mobilize all of these forces and get them where they needed to be in preparation for the invasion. So logistics is very important, is kind of the bottom line. If they'd been able to mobilize faster, Kuwait would have been liberated a lot sooner. Doesn't really speak well to what would have happened if World War III actually had happened. Not that it would have mattered much. The Soviets probably would have nuked any given convoy they found anyway. Soviets developed a number of nuclear-tipped anti-ship missiles that were designed to bust carrier battle groups. Probably would have had plenty left over for convoys. Let's see, the next question was, hey, our ground-based mid-course defense system against ballistic missiles has about 50% success rate in our tests. Do I know whether we can launch more than one interceptor at a given warhead? Yeah, actually, that's exactly what would happen. If there was a target that they wanted to shoot down, an actual live ballistic missile that they wanted to shoot down with a THAAD system or maybe an Aegis anti-missile system, they would use multiple interceptors rather for one target. Which is why I was reading if there actually were an attempt by North Korea to attack, they would probably fire a whole shit ton of ballistic missiles all at once. And probably not even all of them nuclear tipped. A lot of them would probably just act as decoys. Because if you have to fire, I don't know, 4 or 5 interceptors to guarantee a hit against one missile, and they fire 10 missiles, then that's 50 interceptors. And that would probably strain the anti-missile defense capacity in places like Guam or for a naval unit, a set of Aegis destroyers. They would probably struggle to generate the sufficient number of interceptors to guarantee that all of those missiles were shot down. But yeah, to answer your question, definitely multiple interceptors can be fired against one target, and that's what would happen in the event of a conflict or what have you. Let's see. Question, can you talk about how China maintains control through its strict authoritarian regime? Maybe some examples on why it's so hard to overthrow. Thank you. Oh, that's an interesting question. How it maintains control.
Flow of information.
Yeah, controlling information is a big part of it. And historically that was easier because they didn't have to deal with the internet before the 1990s, really. But, plenty of countries have had firm control over information and still had problems with unrest and revolution. In China's case, part of the secret sauce that they have to maintaining power is legitimacy. And in the early going, that legitimacy stemmed from the peasantry. Partly that was from land reform, but partly it was also getting rid of the warlords, chasing them out with the Kuomintang, that is to say the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese Civil War. So in the early days, land reform and bringing something resembling peace and stability to China after what they call the warlords period, what was literally decades of conflict between warlords whom had very little regard for the people of China. Getting rid of them and establishing peace in China was a big source of legitimacy for the party, that is to say the Communist Party of China, in the early going of their rule after the Civil War. So they didn't really have to control information all that much. They were actually relatively popular for a long time. Less so in the cities. People in the cities were a little more critical, unsurprising, given that communists in general like to clamp down and are not good about managing business, the economy. So the economic centers of China were very wary about Communist Party rule. Over time, legitimacy was undermined a bit by things like the 100 Flowers campaign, the Great Leap Forward. The Korean War didn't help. So problems like that undermined the regime a bit. but they still managed to maintain legitimacy amongst a lot of people, because a lot of people were willing to kind of trade that, kind of tolerate that in exchange for peace. Because again, everybody remembered the warlords period, the Chinese Civil War, the Second Sino-Japanese War, the war with Japan. All of that had been so destructive. So people were kind of willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, so to speak. And that on top of, again, the control of information, which restricted how much people actually knew about the catastrophes in the 1950s. A lot of kids, I saw this in a documentary, a lot of the Red Guard, because most of the Red Guard was kids, it was younger people. A lot of them, when they went to the countryside, because the government, one of the ways the government tried to reestablish control during the Cultural Revolution, when all these Red Guard kids were running around, they tried to reestablish control by dispatching them into the countryside to help the peasantry. And that served as a kind of re-education through labor, but it also served to kind of get them out of everybody's hair, because they were causing so much havoc. And a lot of them found out for the first time in the mid-late 60s about how bad the Great Leap Forward had been, about the mass famines from the peasantry, because they'd been disproportionately impacted. And a lot of these kids, again, are from the cities. In the cities, that was where most of the party leadership was, and they had most of the benefits, so they lived more well off. And a lot of these kids were children of that, group of people. I know I said that the cities were very skeptical about party rule at the start, but after a while, the cities became intertwined with the power base of the Communist Party. They became administrative centers of the economy, etc., and as such, a lot of the most well-off people in China tended to be from there and to have strong party connections. So by the time you get to the mid-late 60s, the cities are kind of a bulwark of the party. And the rural areas are kind of a little more skeptical after the mass famines, as you can imagine. But anyway, the point I was trying to make is that a lot of these kids from urban areas went out to the countryside, and they found out for the first time about the Great Leap Forward and what a disaster it was, and that speaks to the level of control that the party had over information transmission. So things were pretty bad after the Cultural Revolution. At that point, the party was not doing too great. But then Deng Xiaoping kind of re-energized the party's legitimacy by establishing economic growth through his economic reforms. And the decades-long, huge degree of economic growth over the past few decades has served to significantly re-establish the legitimacy of the Communist Party. Above and beyond, any control of information or what have you. A lot of people in China are actually very they're obviously all mostly patriotic, but a lot of people in China are actually relatively pro-party, just because of that economic growth. They think the party has done a pretty good job over the past few decades anyway, notwithstanding what happened before. And a lot of them are kind of willing to let the party rule so long as that they have economic opportunities. That's kind of the de facto contract right now. And so in that regard, part of the reason that that the party has such a firm grip on power is because the people themselves are kind of okay with the status quo. I think there's a Slovenian philosopher, and he's kind of eccentric, and he once said that, or at least I heard it from him, maybe somebody else said it, was that revolutions don't start because people are really upset because they don't have what they want. They're upset because the revolution happens because people are disappointed, because things are going relatively well, and then things turn south. People expect things to get better, expect to keep getting more rights, have more opportunities, and then something happens that reverses that. That's when you have a revolution. Even if those people are relatively well off, the disappointment is what kind of spurs the revolution. And that's more likely to cause unrest than, say, just general oppression or general lack of economic opportunity or material wealth. So right now, the Chinese government is doing relatively well in that regard, although the fact that the economy has started to slow down in the past few years is a source of concern for the party, and it's actually one of the reasons that the party has been clamping down politically so much over the past few years. the fall in economic growth is restricting the ambit of economic opportunity that has been the bulwark of their legitimacy for the past few decades. And because the party knows that, they're, for one, clamping down on corruption. That's seen as necessary, because one of the big criticisms of the party is that it's very corrupt, very incestuous in terms of managing the economy and managing its duties as the sole political authority. And that's the, what do they call it? The Tigers and Flies campaign, or something to that effect, where the government is going after not just low-level corrupt officials, but also the big names, very powerful figures in the party, which is always very difficult to do. But again, that's a response to the fall in economic growth. There's also been a big clampdown on civil society, which had, they were never given a free hand completely, but there had been some liberalization in terms of non-government groups being allowed to operate, but they've clamped down on them. And of course, they've also clamped down significantly on freedom of expression on the internet, in terms of what you can say and what's tolerable and what gets censored. The Chinese government employs a huge army of people on the internet whose sole job is just to find things to report to the authorities for censorship, and then to put out pro-government propaganda, to put out pro-government comments. I think they, I don't know if they still call them that, but they used to call them 50 centers, because supposedly they were paid 50 cents a post. So they maintain their rule through a combination of popular rule, popular by way of the economic opportunities the government has provided, and a combination, and the sticks, sticks and carrots. The sticks being the police state, the authority of the police to just survey and watch everybody and censor, censor the public discourse. That's kind of a quick and dirty answer. That's a little convoluted, but off the top of my head, that's what I could give you. I'm sure Pact Fact could probably add a bit to that if she hasn't already, since I know she has some background with it, studying China. And for now, I'll leave it at that. But if I think of something else, I'll bring it up. Let's see. Have you studied use effectiveness consequences of drone usage for surveillance combat? Is it fair game technology at this point, or is it frowned upon, shunned as far as war tactics go? It's been pretty significantly deployed and used on the part of the United States military. So I think it's definitely not shunned, because it's used very regularly, and almost every level of the army, for example, uses them. They even have them at the squad level. They have this little, I don't know what the technical designation is, but there's this little drone that you actually throw by hand in order to get it into the air, and a squad or whatever the formation size is will actually have a guy who can use that just to kind of scope out different areas. That's a very tactical tool. And then, of course, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have something like the Global Hawk, which is this big giant damn thing, big giant UAV that flies at very high altitude and is controlled from, I think, a base in Louisiana or some damn thing. And they use them, they just park those over combat areas, and the cameras are so powerful that they can kind of zoom in wherever they're needed. And that's obviously a strategic tool used at a division level or a high command, whatever the command level would be. And I'm sure there's a whole bunch in between, a whole smattering of UAVs for different commands at different levels. So it's all over the place. It's not shunned at all. As far as combat, same thing. Predator drones are very common. There's no significant pushback there. There's some criticism, but the criticism is not so much over the use of the drones for combat. It's more about how they're used. Specifically in the context of Afghanistan, in the CIA, I think it was, had a assassination program, probably still does, and the criticism was that the criteria they used to determine who was a legitimate target was very, very loose. Basically, it was any group of men over a certain age was considered a viable target if it was in an area that was thought to be opposed to Taliban activity or Al-Qaeda related activity. You know, any such area designated as such, they would basically just kill any group of people, any group of men anyway. Of course, they would sometimes have hard intelligence about a specific person that they wanted to get. Obviously, that person was a legitimate target, but there was a lot of criticism around them being a little too general, a little too liberal, so to speak, in terms of who they went after. And I think they've since suspended that program. They don't do that anymore. I think the military was never quite as liberal in terms of who they targeted. But in any case, the use of the drones themselves was fine. Nobody had a problem with that. That could change in the future. Obviously, there's a discussion about artificial intelligence in war, so there's been some talk about doing something about that. Maybe some restrictions there, but for now, yeah, no reservation. I think even the Islamic State has been using them. They have these little off-the-shelf drones that they'll attach grenades to and whatnot, and they use them to blow people up in the various urban conflagrations they end up in. So let's see, the next one was total change of topic, but I'd like to get his thoughts on how ending DACA might affect the economy.
What's DACA?
If I remember, it's the Affordable Care Act, I think. Here, let me look it up because I don't, I don't want to make a fool of myself any more than I do already. Oh, okay, deferred action for childhood arrivals. That's that immigration mechanism by which children who come here are allowed to stay here. I think they're called dreamers. In the sort of political discourse, the parlance, as it were. Yeah, so basically if you, what was it? If you're born here, or if you were brought here as a child, and you grow up here and whatnot, then DACA is supposed to apply to you and give you some means to stay here. If I'm remembering it correctly anyway, that's what it was. So let's see, the question then was how it might affect the economy. Probably not much, because I don't think there's that many kids here that are eligible for it. It's, what, maybe at most 1 million? And, you know, and those, you know, if you're an illegal immigrant, like just out and out, and you're not eligible for any of these amnesty programs, obviously you know how to function, because there's quite a few of them here in the United States. So I don't think it would be a significant loss in terms of, presumably the principal economic cost would be less labor. These people would be sent away, and so there would be fewer workers doing jobs that people don't want. I don't think, for one, I don't think that a whole lot of them would actually leave. I think if DACA were, then they would just go underground like they were before. So in that sense, it wouldn't have a dramatic impact. But even if you did take all of the DACA-eligible kids and get rid of them, I don't think they represent the bulk of the illegal immigrant population, so I don't think there would be a significant shortfall in labor. So I don't think it would be all that impactful, really, economically speaking. Maybe somebody knows better than me on that regard, because I'm not an immigration guy. I haven't studied significantly labor economics and the labor economics of immigration. So, but from what I know, I don't think it would be that impactful. Oh, PactFact is saying it could be as high as 5 million people. That's pretty substantial. But again, you know, if you got rid of them, then if you get rid of 5 million illegal immigrants, that would make a dent, probably. That might see some wage rises in some of those industries where they work. But my guess is they would be refilled pretty quickly by new illegal immigrants of one sort or another. It's not too hard to get here if you really want to be here and to work as an illegal immigrant. But again, even if even if they get rid of DACA, I don't think that 5 million would just disappear overnight. They would, again, probably just go underground. Yeah, where there's an economic demand for labor, it's going to be met. If not legally, then illegally. That's just basic fundamental economics, basic laws of economics. If there's a significant number of people who are willing to pay good money to have a job done, and they can't get the workers in the country in question, then almost invariably there's going to be a supply of workers from someplace else coming in legally or illegally to take those jobs. Because it's perfectly good money if you're willing to work. There's no reason not to in that regard. And so long as the employer is willing to keep quiet, obviously the illegal immigrant is willing to keep quiet, it's a perfectly efficacious arrangement. A lot of illegal immigrants get a lot of heat in the United States, like they're the problem, but actually the problem is more the employers. If the employers stop hiring them, then they wouldn't be here. But as is, they hire them, they want the labor, and so long as that's the case, there's almost always going to be illegal immigrants here in the U.S., just on that account. Or in any other country, for that matter, that has a labor shortage of that variety, if you can even call that a labor shortage. It's a whole nother discussion we could get into. Let's see. So the next one was, technology has totally upended military strategies several times since Monitor versus Merrimack. And often the military strategists don't realize warfare has changed until the next conflict, when their fancy tech and strategy from the last war is totally useless in the new paradigm. What do you think about U.S. investment in aircraft carriers and manned aircraft in light of this tendency to overinvest in the last war's tech? Yeah, and I've heard a lot of criticism of carrier battle groups as being not particularly useful. I already mentioned before, in the event of a Third World War with the Soviet Union, they probably would have gotten blown up on the first day, just because tactical anti-ship missiles would have just torn the shit out of any given carrier battle group that got hit by them. In that sense, carrier battle groups are more about, and manned aircraft for that matter, are more about projecting force against regions where there's not a lot of ability to fight back. In a place like Iraq, or to a lesser degree Iran, or equivalent regions where there's not a technologically advanced opponent, carrier battle groups are very useful there. They're also good at just about intimidation. If you wanted to sail a carrier battle group in the Taiwan Strait, through the Taiwan Strait, that's a very powerful signal. It's kind of a dare for the Chinese government to do something about it. So they're useful diplomatic tools and signals in that regard. But in terms of an actual conventional war between a peer military, it's debatable how useful they would be in that regard. So that's a legitimate criticism in that regard. The U.S. military has and tried to invest in the next generation of tech. A lot of that is anti-missile technology. There's even this, it's really neat, it's like this big, they took a passenger jet basically, and they stuck a laser cannon in the nose. Well, not a laser cannon, but a laser anyway, a laser weapon. And it's designed to shoot down ballistic missiles in flight. And I don't think it's quite there yet in terms of being fully accurate and dependable, but the technology technically does work. I mean, they actually do have a laser that can shoot a missile in flight. The technology already exists, they're just perfecting it at this point. So something like that. There's obviously a lot of telecommunications development going on. In terms, the ability to fly a UAV from Louisiana, to fly a UAV in Afghanistan or Iraq from Louisiana, that's very impressive in its own right. Investments in that regard. I'm kind of blanking on investments, future tech that the military has been working on. I've probably got a notepad file anyway somewhere loaded with it, but off the top of my head I can't really think too many examples. Back when I was in college, I remember they were developing a satellite-launched kind of kinetic weapon. And the idea was that the weapon would have no explosives, it wouldn't be a nuclear weapon, but just because it was dropped from a satellite in low orbit, the sheer kinetic energy from when it hits the ground would be sufficient to comprise a significant explosion and do a lot of damage in its own right. I'm not sure how legal or how legit that research was, because it's supposed to be illegal to develop weapons in space. The United States nominally adheres to that rule, but I do remember reading about that. That was an idea. That was some work was done on that. There's also railguns. Railguns are pretty interesting. That's meant to be a long-range weapon that you can pack a whole bunch of them, a lot of ammunition, and because they move so quickly, they have a lot of kinetic energy, so they do a lot of damage. So there's been investment there as well. There's been work done on stealth tech, making it harder to detect via radar and lock onto targets. There's stealth planes, stealth helicopters, stealth ships. There's a whole bevy of that. Zoom-walt destroyers, that's another thing the Navy has been working on. I don't know how well that's going. And then, of course, there's the infamous F-35. That's a whole other discussion we could get into. So the United States is investing in the future in terms of future technology. And some of that could ameliorate some of the difficulty that something like a carrier battle group could face. If there were a conflict with a peer military power, hypothetically, if that anti-missile tech works, they could shoot down the incoming nuclear-tipped anti-ship missiles before they hit. I don't know. I mean, because the Chinese are developing their own counters. They're not. They have their own free agency and are watching developments in the United States and trying to develop their own counters as the United States develops its counters. It's a continuous back and forth there in that regard. So they have their famous, what is it, the DF-21, I think they call it. It's supposed to be this carrier-busting ballistic missile that they can launch from over the horizon and will lock onto a carrier as it enters its terminal phase. So supposedly that's one of their counter, because it's a lot harder to shoot down a ballistic missile than it is a cruise missile, so that's the significance of the weapon. Obviously they already have a number of anti-ship cruise missiles. And they're also investing, I guess this isn't future tech per se, but they are investing a lot in submarines. That's an obvious counter to any power with a large navy. You can just invest in submarines and try to get them that way. Because it's still tricky to this day to detect submarines. Submarine warfare is anti-submarine warfare rather is difficult. And given that the Chinese are planning on fighting a war probably relatively close to their territory in relatively confined spaces, that's definitely to their advantage. That's probably well within range of any of their missile systems, and obviously within easy patrol range of their submarine force and their navy, which they're also upgrading. So the U.S. Navy would be at a clear disadvantage operating in the South China Sea or in some similar around Taiwan, for example, some other such area. So I think it's a fair criticism that the United States invests too much in the last war's tech, but I think it is also moving forward. There is future technology kind of in the pipeline to try to deal with developments. The fact that modern technology is proliferating, the things that made the United States hyperpower, so to speak, the technologies that gave it such an edge before are proliferating around the world. So I think they are recognizing that and are trying to account for it in terms of how they structure the military going forward. So shifting towards UAVs, for example, away from manned aircraft, shifting towards more technologically advanced weapon systems, anti-missile technology. I think we talked a little bit a couple weeks ago about how the Navy is trying to distribute its forces, well, the military in general is trying to distribute its forces more evenly across the Asia-Pacific region, instead of having its forces clustered in a few major bases. In a future conflict, hypothetically, who's to say, some country might easily target those with long-range over-the-horizon weaponry, those bases. So they're distributing their forces more evenly to present fewer obvious targets. So that's a strategic innovation. That's an innovation in terms of how forces are deployed above and beyond technology. it's kind of a meandering answer again. That's trying to, but again, off the top of my head, that's what I can think of. Kind of a lot of different directions there. For anybody who doesn't know, because this person in their question mentioned the Merrimack and Monitor. Some of you not from the United States might not know what that is. Some of you from the United States might not know what that refers to. That's a reference to a battle in the U.S. Civil War. It was a naval battle fought between the Confederate Navy and the Union Navy. And the Merrimack, which should be properly called the Virginia, the Merrimack had been a Union warship, wooden warship, that the Confederates had that had been sunk or scuttled at one point. The Confederates managed to retrieve it and put it back into service, and they redesigned it as a armored ship, as an ironclad warship. At this time, the idea of having iron armor on a ship was relatively new, and so it was an innovation. It gave ships a big advantage over wooden ships, because at that time there were not cannons, at least not used in the U.S. Civil War, that could penetrate armor. So the CSS Virginia, or the Merrimack as it was called when it was a Union ship, actually sailed up into the Chesapeake Bay and tore up a number of Union vessels before retreating, and none of those vessels could do anything to the Virginia because of the armor. So the Union, for its part, commissioned, I think it was a European designer, who actually created a specifically ironclad ship. It was designed from the start to be ironclad, and it was actually not made of wood at all. It was almost entirely made of iron. Or well, maybe it's not iron, steel, or whatever it was made of. And it was a weird-looking ship. You know, I would encourage any enthusiast in military history to look up the USS Monitor. It was a kind of weird craft. It was very low to the, not ground, that's not the way, it had a low water line. And almost the only thing that popped up above the water line was the turret. So this little vessel, which was almost meant more for riverine combat, because obviously it was not fit for ocean operation, was sent to fight the Virginia, the Confederate ironclad. And the result was that these two ironclad ships fought each other for like an hour, a couple hours, like that, with no result, because neither had weapons that could penetrate the other's armor. So they shot the shit out of each other for a little while, and then both left. And that was the end of it. So that's an example of new technology, a new innovation in warfare being brought to bear in a new conflict in which a lot of the ships were still designed according to traditional naval precepts, you know, kind of designed for the last war, so to speak. And those wooden warships were not at all capable of fighting those, you know, either the Merrimack or the Monitor, depending. So somebody asked, can I get your opinion on the Nordic political system and your thoughts on their centrist values? Nordic political system. Well, in general, for anyone who doesn't know, the Nordic countries, specifically referring to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, not so much Finland, that's another discussion we could have as to where Finland fits into that. Those countries are known for having strong welfare states, for their governments providing strong social benefits to the population. So a lot of people in the United States who would like a stronger role for government and providing security for people in terms of social benefits kind of point to the Nordic countries as a success story, a successful model that the United States could emulate. It's not, I mean, in terms of why, if you're asking why they're centrist and why they do that, I don't know enough Scandinavian history to answer that, to go into that level of depth. I know they used to be very barbaric, because the Vikings were, well, assholes, to put it mildly. But as they were Christianized and as the countries in question modernized, they over time became very stable. And at some point, they just became paragons of peace and prosperity in Europe. Sweden, for its part, has been known for its neutrality over the past, since the early 1800s or so. In fact, there was some, I don't remember who it was, there was some singer or some celebrity who everybody was making fun of her because she used Sweden as an example of a neutral country instead of Switzerland. But I thought that was a little unfair, because that Sweden is actually a legit example of a neutral country. Maybe not as neutral as Switzerland, but still a legitimate example. In any case, they ended up, over time, developing strong social democratic politics. And again, I don't know enough about that history to know why they did that and not other countries in the region. In terms of, comparing that to the United States or to other countries, to a degree the model isn't really replicable, because those countries are very small. I think Sweden is the largest, and it has a population of 10 million, I think. Something to that effect. So it's not a whole lot of people, and they're very, very homogenous. They're all Swedish. There's not like a lot of regional variance like there is here in the United States. You have a lot of different kinds of Americans here in the U.S. depending on region and depending on background and what have you. But there's no equivalent in Sweden to the American South, for example, or California. It's just Sweden. Everybody is pretty much the same, has the same background, lives in the same areas. Also, Norway, for its part, pays for a lot of its benefits through oil. Norway is actually a relatively significant oil producer, and so their budget is bolstered significantly through oil revenues. And so that gives them an increased capacity to pay for very large social benefits, very generous social benefits. And so in that regard, not quite replicable for the United States, which, for one, has a huge population, much larger than Norway, but also doesn't have as much per capita oil revenue. If you make a lot of money from oil and you have a small population, it's not hard to have a very generous social welfare set of social welfare programs. The Saudis do the same. Any number of Middle Eastern oil producers do that. But in the case of the United States, we have a much larger population and not as much per capita in oil revenue that we could spend on benefits. So that's probably not a great answer. You're probably asking more for why they are the way they are, and I don't know about them to give a solid answer there. So, apologies.
Apology accepted.
I guess you could say that the neutrality is part of that. Maybe part of the reason Sweden is so mellow is because they've tried to stay out of most of Europe's conflicts. They were neutral through the 2 world wars and have generally been relatively economically prosperous. So war and economic depression are really good ways to mess up your politics. That generally leads to the emergence of radical political factions and groups and corresponding instability. Sweden didn't have that, so maybe that's part of the reason that they've been relatively well off. But that still doesn't quite address the centrist politics. Yeah, I would just have to read more about it. I would just have to look into it more. Oh, an India question. India is number 2 population in the world, yet we rarely hear anything about them on a global spectrum. Can you give a quick TLDR on their stance/impact on the world? Yeah, when you have a population of more than 1 billion people, you tend to be pretty insular. Because you've generally got plenty to deal with at home without going overseas and dealing with problems there. It's actually the same with China. The Chinese Communist Party is most interested in maintaining its rule in China, and because they have so many people, more than 1 billion people there, that keeps them pretty thoroughly occupied. So the Communist Party of China doesn't care all that much about what goes on outside China. Generally, it doesn't interfere too much there, and what it does overseas, it generally relates somehow to bolstering its legitimacy in China, in other words, to domestic politics. So India is similar. The Indian government is generally not that concerned with other parts of the world or projecting force or using its influence in international affairs. In so much as it does, it mostly concerns itself with its own national security. So we've talked a bit about the border disputes, keeping the Chinese, for example, on the other side of the Himalayas, and trying to make sure that there's sufficient deterrent to keep Pakistan from acting too crazy in Kashmir. Those would probably be the extent of it. Beyond that, the Indian government doesn't do much in terms of regional or global international relations. Economically, it's not a big enough power to really have a lot of global brands or to act as a, well, it is a large enough market to be attractive and to hold a lot of sway amongst foreign exporters, foreign companies that want to tap that market. So they could have a lot of influence there in terms of the global economy and in terms of global trade. But the economy in India is still so heavily regulated that a lot of foreign investors are not really excited about going there, and that's actually put a dent in their economic growth a bit. So on that count, there's not a lot of companies outside of India are really dependent on the Indian market, as compared to, say, China, where a lot of companies are very dependent on China trade for their bottom line. India doesn't yet have that kind of pull because it's yet to create a favorable enough regulatory regime to significantly attract investment from outside India. So that's one of the reasons that you don't hear is them. They just don't have nearly as many economic ties with the rest of the world yet, as opposed to China, which has very significant ties. And then they also are just very quiet in terms of national security. You know, after independence, the Nehru government, the Indian government, which was led by Nehru at that time, their whole national security strategy was nobody would be crazy enough to invade a country as big as India, so don't worry about it. That was basically their perspective. So they didn't really worry a lot about building a large military or about, you know, security issues going on their border, at least outside of Pakistan and Kashmir anyway. The border war with China in the 1960s came as a big shock to them. They invested a bit more in their military then, but they still didn't try to project force, so to speak, that much. As far as their stance, their diplomatic stance is actually kind of interesting. Indian diplomacy is kind of a legacy of the Cold War, to a degree anyway. After independence, India's position was one of non-alignment, and they were part of what was called the non-aligned movement in the Cold War, which was basically countries that did not side with either the United States or the Soviet Union in the Cold War. You know, their whole bag was neutrality, which it didn't sit well with the United States government because they framed the Cold War as good versus evil. So sitting on the sidelines was almost seen as a dereliction of duty in a sense, an abdication of moral responsibility to fight totalitarian communism. That was more true in the 1950s under the Dulles brothers when they were in government. But Soviets, of course, didn't really care one way or the other. They were quite happy just to have countries that were not nominally, or as they perceived it, nominally dedicated to their destruction. So the non-aligned movement was definitely a big part of India's diplomacy. They tried to stay out of the Cold War politics. Insomuch as they did delve into it, they tended to side with the Soviets, just because they had been a colonized people, and so they tended to side with other colonized peoples in the world. There was a significant European empire in the developed, in places like Africa and the Middle East, etc., and Asia, well into the 1960s. So there was plenty of criticism there as far as anti-imperialist sentiment. And being a preeminent anti-imperialist country, or having anti-imperialism as a central part of Indian politics, that manifested a lot in their international relations. They were generally very critical of Western Europeans and more supportive of the Soviets, which they saw as being more explicitly anti-imperialist. So their stance tends to be one of sovereignty, unsurprising for colonized people, sovereignty respecting the rights of independent nations and not violating borders and what have you, so things to that effect. They have been supportive of sanctions against Iran, so there is a limit to which they're willing to practice that insularity. As far as global security issues, they will kind of toe the line in terms of things for which there is a consensus. So something like nuclear proliferation, which is a little bit ironic given that they illegally developed a nuclear weapon in violation of proliferation rules, for which they actually had bad relations with the United States for a while because of that in the 90s. The United States did not want them to build a nuclear weapon and develop one, and so sanctions were put in place in the 90s, and there was kind of a low ebb in relations there for a while until think the Modi administration, when the Modi administration and the Bush administration negotiated basically recognition of the legitimacy of India's nuclear program, both in terms of the nuclear weapons and in terms of the nuclear energy sector, which the Indian government was working on. I think the Bush administration worked to facilitate their entry into the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And the Nuclear Suppliers Group is basically a group of countries that has the capacity to build, at the very least, nuclear energy, to develop and build nuclear power plants, but also nuclear weapons, generally nuclear weapons. And the idea there is that, so if you must develop this technology, then please do so within the rubric of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which has lots of regulations and oversights to make sure the technology does not proliferate further beyond the countries that already have the technology. So the United States, for a while, countries in the Nuclear Suppliers Group had opposed India's entry in order to put pressure on them to relinquish their nuclear program and to be rid of it since it was illegal, but the United States kind of gave them a pass and tried to kind of give them an out, tried to really alleviate the pressure there. So that helped Indian-American relations a lot. They've gotten better since then. But in general, to answer the question, India's stance on issues tends to be one of sovereignty above all. They generally don't like interventions. They've been very critical of American and European interventions in the Middle East, although it's pretty low bar. It's pretty easy to criticize those. Yeah, so roughly that's why India doesn't have a big presence, doesn't have a very prominent image in terms of international relations. So the next question was, I'd love to hear about my knowledge commentary on Lysenkoism in the 1930s and 60s USSR. I know it is a little obscure, but I've recently fallen into a wormhole and wonder if you can shed some light. If not, no worries, etc. So, yeah, I've never heard of it, so I'd have to read about it myself. Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union. Huh. Yeah, no, I've never heard of it. Thank you for the tip, though. That looks interesting. I'll have to read more about that. Yeah, I guess this would be a good point to mention that I speak from my background in graduate school. I learned a good deal in graduate school about a sundry topics, and then going out of my way to read world news, and following topics in BBC World News, think tanks, etc. When I have the time, anyway. So I'm not an expert on everything. Is the point I'm making? Not everything I talk about is something that I have absolute knowledge about. And I try to be pretty clear about the things I know more about, as opposed to the things I don't. So that's my disclaimer there. Let's see, piggybacking on the last question, I just saw something in my news feed about Muslims being targeted in Myanmar. Any insight on that would be nice. It's not Muslims per se, it's a specific ethnic group called Rohingya, and it's a little unclear about what their history is. Burmese nationalists are of the mind that they're actually illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. The Rohingya themselves argue that they have long-standing roots in the region, specifically Rakhine region, or Rakhine region, however you pronounce it. It's basically a small region in southwestern Burma, or Myanmar, or whatever you want to call it. We could talk about the name of Burma there. That's another interesting discussion. But yeah, they lived in a small area in southwestern Burma along the border with Bangladesh. And they're a Muslim group in a predominantly Buddhist country, and they're pretty poor and rural. They don't really bother anybody as far as I know, but nationalists in Burma have had a hair up their ass about them for a long time. And, well, that's the long and short of it. I think part of it has to do with the history of imperialism, because the British did import a number of workers from Bangladesh, or Bengal as it was called then, in order to work on plantations in Bengal. Or plantations in Burma, rather. And so I think there might be a sense among nationalists in Burma that They're kind of a legacy of colonialism, and as such are a taint on the nation. And then the nation cannot really be pure, cannot be cleansed of the taint of colonialism until they're gone. Yeah, we talked a bit about the Sri Lankan Civil War, I think last time, or a couple weeks ago, or whenever it was. And one of the reasons for that conflict, to kind of reiterate that point, was that the Tamils had largely migrated into Sri Lanka because of the plantations that the British set up. They were imported as workers for those plantations. And so the Sinhalese population, the predominant population, kind of saw them as a legacy of colonialism and as such kind of a taint on the nation. The Rohingya is kind of similar as far as Burma and Burmese politics go, I think. That's just from what I haven't read a whole lot about Burmese nationalism and the history thereof, but from what little I've read in the news about it, that's my understanding of it anyway. Part of that also has to do with Burmese democratization. So there is a woman named, I'm probably going to butcher her name, I think her name is Aung Suu Kyi. And she's been this sort of saintly pro-democracy figure leading the democracy movement in Burma for several decades now. And basically she's in charge of the government. After we talked a little bit last time about how the Burmese military, which has ruled Burma for much of the past, since independence basically, had basically followed a course of democratization after a natural disaster. There was a typhoon, I think, that really wrecked the country, and the military's response was very poor. And that in addition to mounting pressure for democracy on the part of Burmese citizens, and the cost incurred by Burmese diplomatic isolation, since it was a very isolationish country, they were kind of becoming overly dependent on China, and that bothered the nationalists and the Burmese military. That all led to a kind of an opening of the country to the world, and part of establishing economic relations, which was needed because the economy was backwards. Part of the trade-off was democratization. So in order to kind of get money to develop the economy, they agreed to liberalize the country's politics. And as a result of that, an election was held, and Aung Suu Kyi ended up in control of the government. Not really, because the military, being the cagey bastards they are, passed a rule that made it illegal for people who, have dual citizenship, I think, to run for government, or run for president, or whatever position it was. And so someone else had to run for that leadership position, president, I think it was. Maybe it was prime minister, on the part of the pro-democracy political party that was led by Aung Suu Kyi. And Aung Suu Kyi, for her part, said that even if it wasn't her who was prime minister, she would still run things behind the scenes, and she was very explicit about that. That was actually kind of a power play on her part. She basically all but said, yeah, it won't be me in charge technically, but I'm going to govern things, so if you want to vote for me, just vote for the party, and I'll basically be de facto in control. And that's basically what happened. The prime minister is all but a figurehead, and Aung Suu Kyi is principally responsible for decision-making on the part of the government. The thing is, the government has limited powers. The military wrote a constitution that allowed democratic elections and a democratic form of government, but it reserved a lot of powers for itself. For example, the Burmese military has autonomy in terms of national security issues. So Aung Suu Kyi can't stop the military from doing something if the military asserts its right, if it asserts that something that it wants to do is in the national interest, in national security interest. Also, the Burmese military wrote into the constitution that it has 25% of the seats in the parliament reserved for itself. So in other words, the Burmese military can appoint its own people, its own representatives into the parliament. A number of parliamentarians represent equivalent to 25% of the total seats in parliament, which gives them a de facto veto over any constitutional changes that the government might have. So if the government might want to, say, reduce the government's power by making changes to reduce the military's power, rather, by making changes to the Constitution, the government would not have the necessary votes to do that, basically. Because the military controls 25% of the parliament, any reformer would not be able to reach the threshold necessary to pass constitutional changes because of the way the Constitution is written. You have to have a certain proportion, something like 2/3, or no, it would have to be more than that, but some proportion of seats would be required to make changes to the Constitution, and having 25% of the parliament gives the military de facto veto. So the democratic government, Aung Suu Kyi's government in Burma, is kind of tenuous. You know, the military still retains a lot of power, and it could hypothetically reverse any of these changes almost any time it wanted, because again, it has the monopoly on violence, being in control of the security apparatus, the police, the military, etc. And as a result, the military kind of tries to, well, the ball's in their court, but what I'm getting at is that there's a tension between Aung Suu Kyi and the military. They're political rival. And one of the things that I suspect, I can't prove it, but I suspect that the military is using the Rohingya issue to kind of undermine Aung Suu Kyi's government, or popularity. Because here's the thing, mistreating and abusing the Rohingya population is popular amongst the Burmese population. And, you know, again, that's probably nationalism at work, but it is what it is. And so Aung Suu Kyi, who is a very popular figure, is put in a position where she either has to do the popular thing and kind of countenance the mistreatment, or she can do the right thing, which would be to condemn it, but then undermine her popularity, which would give the military a stronger presence in parliament, give them more votes in the next election, which would undermine the reform program that she wants to implement as a democratic reformer. So part of the problem the Rohingya face is that they're caught between a rock and a hard place. You know, they can't really tap the government, which is, you know, democratic and relatively liberal, Aung Suu Kyi's government anyway. They can't go to her because the military is trying to force her to do that, trying to get her to do that, to undermine her and the democratization movement. Yeah, believe it or not, there are actually radical Buddhists in the world, and Burma has them. Burmese nationalists, Buddhist nationalists, will actually go out and countenance this mistreatment and actually participate in it sometimes. You actually see the same thing. Yeah. Well, no, not the Tamil Tigers. They're Hindu. The Sinhalese population is the Buddhists, and the Sri Lankans, they actually are very anti-Tamil, very chauvinist. And so these Buddhist radicals, nationalists, criticize them. Also, actually, yeah, fair point. Also Muslims in Sri Lanka, what few there are. But they're very intolerant and very aggressive, which you would not expect of Buddhists. Kind of a side note, Sri Lanka was originally just called Lanka. That's kind of the historical name, sort of the indigenous name for that territory. And Sri was added, I think, in the 1960s or 70s. And Sri basically means it translates roughly to holy or great. And so they basically named their country Great Lanka. And that was just pure politics. You know, basically some nationalists said, hey, our country is great, let's name it Sri, and that became a thing. So, classic political pandering at work there.
That sounds appropriate. I don't know if this is the theme, though, of countries that go ham with their name, trying to emphasize certain stuff, and it usually means the opposite. Like Democratic Republic of the Congo, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It's like, how democratic is it if you have to put it in the name?
Well, Democratic Republic is something that socialist and communist governments came up with. Because after after World War II and during the decolonization process, you know, the winding down of European empires, a lot of countries had the choice of becoming, you know, of government basically. What kind of government did they want? And socialist governments kind of looked around at the world and saw a lot of republics, but a lot of those republics did not give power to the people in a way that they would have considered acceptable. You know, if you're a communist or a socialist, you want power to the people, not just to representatives of the people or to a sort of patrician class that rules because it has access to more resources and is better able to have to exercise control over the political machinery of a country. So for those people, for those socialists and communists, They wanted their countries to not be republics in that sense. They wanted them to be true republics, republics of the people, or democratic republics. So that's where the phrase democratic republic comes from. And almost every communist government ended up having that as their name, democratic republic of this, that, or the other. So I accidentally skipped a question. It was Agent Smith mentioned that there was a lot of ethnic tensions in Malaysia. Can he go into detail of what they are? Yeah, Malaysia has a lot of racial problems. So the indigenous population is ethnically Malay, and they're basically a kind of, I think, Polynesian group, or maybe Melanesian, one of those anyway. But they're an indigenous group. They've lived there. They've always been there, and they're predominantly Islamic. They're Muslims, and their history had been pretty independent up until the late 1800s. And that was when the British kind of annexed them into the British Empire. It was a bit more complicated than that. Basically, the Malay Peninsula had a number of, I think they were emirates, Islamic emirates. And these emirates were assigned rather, what were called residences. And basically a resident is a representative of Great Britain that would go to a territory and quote-unquote advise the government in question on policy. And generally the advice was in the interest of the British government and involved warning against doing anything that went against the interest of the British government. And if anything, if the government in question did anything that went against the wishes of the resident, there was always the implicit threat of military action. So the British government assigned a series of residents to these different emirates and basically established control over them by that way. They still retained a lot of autonomy. They were never, I think, directly controlled by the British like some other parts of the world were. But effectively they were controlled by the effectively part of the British Empire. And the thing that attracted the British to the Malay Peninsula was, I think, aluminum originally. There's a lot of bauxite deposits there. But the thing was there was not a lot of people living on the Malay Peninsula at the time. And the British needed a lot of people to work in these mines that they were setting up. And so in order to get miners there, they started importing Chinese workers. And over time they imported so many that ethnic Chinese ended up being a significant minority on the peninsula. And then of course they also imported some Indians to act as bureaucrats and to police and what have you. So there is also, I think, 10% of the population now is also South Asian. But the principal groups are Malays and Chinese. And there was a lot of tension between the Malays and the Chinese because the Malays saw them, again, kind of going back to the previous discussion, Malay nationalists saw the Chinese as interlopers and kind of a legacy of colonialism, a legacy of imperialism. And so they don't like them. Besides the just innate cultural and ethnic differences between them, there's also that nationalist perspective as well. So when Malaysia was to be granted independence, there was a huge debate about how that would happen. Because the Malays, for their part, did not really want to have to deal with the Chinese minority there. I think the Chinese make up something like a third of the population in Malaysia today. But at the same time, they didn't really want to give up territory to the Chinese because that was their territory. They saw that as being implicitly Malay, explicitly rather Malay, and so there was a desire not to give it up. And so there was a lot of conflict, a lot of discussions, and a lot of rivalry, and part of it erupted into a civil war in the mid-late 1950s, late 50s, early 60s, what was called the Malay Emergency, and that was the communist revolt against the Malay government, or the colonial Malay government, and the British ended up fighting that insurgency for a number of years and was very successful at it. It's one of the few examples of a foreign power waging a successful counterinsurgency in another country. What happened was that most of the communists in question were Chinese, and it kind of tied into the rise of the Communist Party of China over in the mainland China. And the Malays, for their part, were happy to work against them because of the ethnic rivalry. So the British had, ready and willing allies on the ground, willing to kind of crack down on the Chinese community. By no means was the Chinese community mostly communist or sympathetic thereof, but the communists could only ever really found substantial support amongst the Chinese community there. So they were never able to gain traction amongst the Malay community. But the fact that it was mostly Chinese rebelling further embittered relations between the two groups. And, almost throughout the Cold War, there was a suspicion on the part of the Malays that the Chinese were sort of fifth columnists. Fifth columnists is another word for traitors, basically, potential traitors or sympathizers with the nation's enemies. There was a sense that they were in cahoots with the Chinese communists. So there was a lot of mistrust on that count. So after that, the British wanted to grant them independence. They also wanted independence, to be fair. So the question was, how do you divide up Malaysia in a way that, caters to Malay desires for independence, but also minimizes ethnic tension? And the British, for their part, ultimately went with the solution, and the Malays kind of grudgingly agreed, which was to combine all of these territories together. Because again, the Malay Peninsula had been separated into different emirates, and Borneo as well, which ended up as part of Malaysia. And they all ended up getting lumped together in one country, which was a little unwieldy, given that they'd all been de facto independent countries before. And so the way that they avoided ethnic tension was basically to take the principal political parties of the Chinese and the Malays and to have them get together beforehand and create a kind of super coalition, a kind of big coalition government that incorporated parties from all groups. And that worked for, I think, only a couple of years before that fell apart. The coalition involved power sharing, and so everybody had representation. That was nominally how they'd secured peace in the first place, but eventually tensions got to be too much. And what happened was Singapore, which at that time had been part of Malaysia, that was all, Singapore and Malaysia were all one country at that time at independence. Singapore was expelled from Malaysia, and that was a popular initiative on the part of the Malay political groups and Malay nationalists. And the reason they wanted to expel Singapore was because that was the largest single population center for Chinese in Malaysia. And so that getting rid of Singapore significantly reduced the political power of Chinese in Malaysia. And as a result, there was not nearly as much of a need to negotiate and give concessions to Chinese political interests in Malaysia. And ever since then, there's been a kind of equilibrium. There are the Chinese political parties and Malay political parties and Indian political parties. They reformed that big coalition with relatively more power now laying with the Malays. And the Malays were in turn able to kind of get what they wanted. They were able to get the level of power that they wanted in order to feel secure. The Chinese, meanwhile, in Singapore got what they wanted in that they didn't have to put up with the Malays' bullshit anymore. They got their own little city-state, which of course has been enormously successful. But even in the past few decades, racial tensions have never quite completely gone away. There's a lot of tension between the Chinese, who tend to be more urban and relatively secular and relatively well-off. There was also a lot of Chinese that came to Malaysia, not as miners, but as traders, and they tended to be relatively wealthy. And the Malays, who tend to be more rural, less wealthy, and much more religiously conservative. So just an obvious, in any country, that would be the grounds for divide. In fact, in most countries, that is the divide. But the racial element makes it all the more difficult to deal with. It makes it all the more sensitive a problem. So that's kind of a brief history of racial tension in Malaysia. Is he surprised or disappointed that ASSK hasn't stopped the displacement/genocide of the Rohingya after finally winning some control over Myanmar? Yeah, it is disappointing. Obviously you would prefer them to do that, but I think, again, part of the reason that the military does go out of its way to do that, to commit those atrocities, is to put pressure on Aung Suu Kyi and to try to create a divide between the international community and Aung Suu Kyi's democratic government. It's a kind of divide and rule strategy on the part of the military to try to isolate her government from international support. Because otherwise she would get, unmitigated praise. She's been fighting for democracy and liberalization of the Burma for decades. And, again, she's kind of a saintly figure almost in Burma on that account for standing up to the Burmese military. And so in order to kind of undercut her support, the Burmese military tries to use the fact that she can't stop them from committing these acts and taking advantage of the fact that these acts are popular politically in Burma to try to create that divide. So on the one hand, I would prefer that she condemn them and do something about it more than what she's been doing. But on the other hand, I can kind of totally understand why. There's kind of a greater project at work, that being the liberalization and democratization of Burma. And condemning the military too much kind of puts that at risk, which of course is exactly what the Burmese military wants. So I'm kind of torn on it. I understand why why she takes the position she does. And, I blame the military more for that than her. Because, I do think they do that on purpose. So I think they deserve more blame than the Aung Suu Kyi regime for that. But, she does have culpability there. That ultimately was her decision to kind of take that line. Let's see, would love to hear what I think of the news that Canada has been seeking and giving asylum to LGBT Chechens and what the effect will be on Canadian, maybe even NATO relations with Russia. I hadn't heard that. But I have heard of the Chechen thing. In Chechnya, for those not familiar with this, Chechnya is basically run by a dictator. It's a province of Russia. It's an oblast in Russia, an autonomous province. But it has way more autonomy than it should. It really is basically an independent dictatorship that is only part of Russia in name only. The Russian government made that trade-off, basically giving Ramzan Kadyrov, or more accurately Ramzan Kadyrov's father, de facto dictatorship status in Chechnya in exchange for ending the Chechen War, in exchange for loyalty and clamping down on rebel groups that had not stopped fighting the Russian government. And Kadyrov's reign has been rather brutal. In fact, it's quite probable, if unprovable at this point, that a lot of the assassinations that have been happening in Russia over the past 10 years have probably been directed by the Chechen government and Kadyrov rather than the Russian government itself and Putin. He can get away with that because he has that degree of autonomy. To the point, Kadyrov, over the past year or so, there are allegations that the Kadyrov government has been rounding up gay people and forcing them into camps and converting them or abusing them, or maybe even killing them. So that's the genesis of that. The Canadian government, apparently, because again I haven't heard this, has been taking in LGBT Chechens. So what effect would that have on Canada, Russia-Canadian relations? Probably none. Because I don't think the Russian government, or Russians in general, really like Kadyrov or the Chechen government at all, for that matter, really at all. The Chechen government down there does a lot of things that most Russians don't like, and they only tolerate it out of the interest of peace, so that the Chechen wars don't start up again. So in that sense, no change. I don't think the Russians would mind it that much. Obviously, Russians have a reputation now for not being very tolerant of the LGBT community in Russia. But I don't think the Russian government considers that like a big plank of their foreign policy. I don't think the Russian government considers it like an important interest of Russia to try to stop countries from taking LGBT refugees from Russia or Chechnya. So no source of tension. I don't think they would see it as aggressive, so no status quo basically, no change. Do you think the increase in right-wing attitudes in Europe, like UKIP in England for instance, will continue to gain ground, or will Europe remain largely liberal? Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What is the future of liberalism in Europe? It seems to have been. It seems to be recovering now. It seems to be doing better now in the wake of the election of Trump, and since Angela Merkel over in Germany has significantly pared down her pro-immigration policies. So there seems to be much less fuel, so to speak, for populism in Germany, if not Europe generally, given what an engine Germany was for creating anti-immigrant backlash, not just in Germany, but Europe writ large. And also Trump has kind of served as, Trump, whether you like him or not, in Europe, has been seen as a cautionary tale. He's been seen as what happens when populists are voted in and the damage they can do. So a lot of people in Europe have kind of soured on populist political movements on account of Trump and some of the things he's done.
Well, and then one of the things you've talked about is the difference between having a populist image and actually being a populist, in the sense that your primary effort is to help as many people as possible and kind of follow those political lines.
Yeah, imagery is important, and that's one of my criticisms of liberals. I use the word liberal in the classical sense for any Americans listening, that classical liberalism. In Europe, a lot of the establishment political parties, almost all of which are liberal, fundamentally liberal, they don't yet have the populists kind of the benefit of the doubt that the public gives to populists. You know, the whole reason populist parties kind of took off in Europe in the first place is because they were seen as being more legitimate, as being more honest than the establishment parties. And right now, despite the fact that people are kind of souring on populists, it could still easily swing back the other way. Because again, there's a lot of people who are very upset about the way the economy in Europe is going. A lot of people are upset about, you know, demographic changes in Europe. And the establishment parties still don't have good, solid solutions to those problems. And if they continue to fail to deliver, and especially if they continue to fail to deliver after promising to deliver, which is an even more important aspect of the discontent that they cause, if that continues to happen, then populist parties in Europe could easily recover from the recent trough and make a big return. Yeah, obviously Hungary and Poland are the principal examples of illiberalism in Europe right now. I think in Hungary it's more deserved than in Poland, because Viktor Orban has basically gone out of his way to paint himself as an illiberal Democrat. I don't think the Law and Justice Party in Poland has done it so much. Their illiberalism has been more implicit. They don't claim that they want to be an authoritarian illiberal democracy. They've just done some things that have undermined liberal culture, democratic norms in Poland. But they don't have an explicitly liberal agenda per se, at least not as they would call it. So I'm not as worried about Law and Justice in that regard. And I would add that Polish civil society has responded pretty strongly to the controversial moves of the Law and Justice Party. So in that sense, that's very encouraging. You know, I haven't seen the same degree of mobilization on the part of Hungarian liberals, for example. So it's difficult to say what the future will hold, but I think it depends in large part on how the economy goes. I think the immigration problem has kind of solved itself. Angela Merkel, again, has moved away from that, and immigration is being pared down significantly. And there will probably be further measures to reduce immigration into Europe. So that issue has been dealt with. That was one of the big big problems, the big antagonizing factors as far as populism in Europe. In terms of the economy, though, that's a lot more tricky. If it can improve, then that would be great, but there's so much opposition in Europe, especially a place like, say, France, to reform, that it's difficult to say where economic growth can come from in lieu of real reform in terms of liberalizing the economy. You know, you have to give something to get something, and Europe is at a point where it basically just has to loosen its welfare states. It has to liberalize its economic regulatory regime if it wants to generate any significant growth. And you know, that's just realistic. I mean, whether you like Europe's social benefit programs and its largesse therein or not, whatever you think of that, it's just at a point where it's unsustainable now. You have to generate economic growth that can sustain and pay for those programs, and Europe has kind of gotten to a point where it's really straining to find those resources. So some degree of liberalization has to happen. But again, there's so much political opposition to it. That's one of the attractions of populists. You know, they're seen as, they offer quick solutions. We're going to reform the economy and generate growth and solve these problems without doing any of the reforms that are unpopular that you don't want, which is horseshit. They're not going to do, that's not going to happen. You know, if they pass the reforms that they talk about, the limited populist reforms, they wouldn't generate the economic growth that they want, most likely anyway. It would not be, any growth they did generate would probably be not be substantive enough to really solve Europe's problems in that regard. So if anybody, if any establishment party or liberal party or what have you can finally find a solution to that, or at least find a solution that people think works, create the illusion that they're solving the problem, that would probably be sufficient to ensure the security of liberalism as the predominant political ideology of Europe. But if not, very easily could be another resurgence of populism. Yeah, we've talked about this subject a fair amount before, and I gave a better answer before in previous weeks when we talked about it. So I would refer the listener to those discussions if you want a more fleshed out answer. Let's see. I'm not sure you talked about this previously, but how will the political fallout from the ousting of former South Korean President Park affect the political landscape as it pertains to dealing with North Korea? Yeah, so Park was a conservative. She was a right-winger. In fact, she was the son of a previous military dictator of South Korea. Or not son, daughter, rather. And the government that won the election in the wake of the impeachment, in the wake of her impeachment, was a left-wing government. And its line... the line of this left-wing government in power now in South Korea is much softer on North Korea. I think when they took power, they wanted to take a more conciliatory approach to North Korea. Generally, conservatives in Korea want to be relatively more confrontational with North Korea. And generally, the political left embraces more of what they call a sunshine policy. The sunshine policy was specifically a policy put in place by a liberal left government in South Korea in the what I want to say 90s or aughts, around there. And this left government was kind of thinking more in those terms. But that's kind of been scuppered by the North Korean government's nuclear program and a lot of the actions they've been taking with regard to that. So, as a result, this government has actually ended up having to take a harder line. Yeah, one of the things they did when they first got into power was they delayed the deployment of THAAD to South Korea. The United States, in response to the escalation in the pace of the North Korean nuclear program, stated that it would deploy THAAD missile systems to South Korea. And if you don't know what that is, that's Theater High Altitude Air Defense. And that's an anti-missile system that's been in development for decades. I remember reading about it when I was a kid, actually, way back in the late 90s. They wanted that missile system is more or less ready to go, and they wanted to deploy it there in order to act as a defense against any North Korean attack. But more specifically, they wanted to use it as a diplomatic signal to kind of to declare the displeasure with the North Korean actions, to signal to North Korea that, basically to signal to them that there was a military option, so to speak, that they had the capability to shoot down missiles, and to try to discourage them basically from using them. Again, relatively unlikely, but it's a useful signal to send when you're in a confrontation like this. And then, basically the South Korean government, this left government, was not really gung-ho. They thought that was needlessly confrontational, needlessly escalated tensions. It didn't help that the Chinese were wicked pissed about it too, because the THAAD missile system comes with a very powerful radar system that the Chinese were angry about because they said it could see into their territory. They thought that the U.S. would use it to spy on them or some such. And so the Chinese were putting a lot of pressure on South Korea to block the deployment of the THAAD missile systems. So South Korea didn't want to further escalate tensions with North Korea and was facing pressure with China on that account. They delayed the deployment of the THAAD missile systems using some bureaucratic mechanism. I think if I remember it correctly, they delayed it by saying that an environmental review was needed in order to review the environmental impact that the THAAD missile deployment would have on the South Korean environment. I wouldn't think it would be that big an impact, but apparently it takes several months to do one of these studies, and so that was the nominal excuse they gave for delaying deployment. But I think they ended up removing whatever blocks they were. They ended up being okay with it as the situation got worse. As tensions have escalated, the regime has sided more with the United States in terms of dealing with the North Koreans. and less has exhibited this sort of traditional sunshine policy. So in that sense, the impeachment of Park has led temporarily and could lead to, in the long term, a more conciliatory, mellow South Korean position vis-a-vis North Korea. But for now, given tensions the way they are, it hasn't made much of a difference. They're kind of having to act tough in response. Let's see, so for all you know about the world and its current events, how often does a piece of info affect your daily life and how you go about things, other than being a piece of knowledge and able to converse about it? Yeah, not much, because I, like anybody, am not generally affected by most of the stuff that goes on in the world. So any given piece of info is not that relevant to my personal life. You know, I study most of this stuff, well, I had to study a lot of it as part of my graduate studies, but also a lot of it I just study on my own out of general interest. So not out of any need to or out of any direct impact on me, just general interest. So in that regard, not a lot of impact. Can you talk about who is strong and who isn't in the political sense? I sort of don't get things because the scales seem unbalanced in Asia. Given PactFacts notes here, I'm assuming you're referring to political strength in terms of international relations. Yeah, some elaboration would be useful there. But roughly speaking, diplomatic leverage is what political power means in terms of international relations. And who gets diplomatic leverage depends a lot on, well, for one, military force, obviously, because that's a credible threat. If you have a powerful military that you can deploy to a given region, or in the case of the United States, everywhere and anywhere, that makes your threats credible to use that force. You know, if somebody does something you don't like, and you threaten to do something militarily about it, but you don't have any military, nobody cares. You know, you have to have that military in place to make your threats credible. And in turn, credible threats make for more compelling and persuasive diplomatic arguments. But beyond diplomatic heft is also economic heft. China and the United States use a lot of that. You can use the fact that countries want or need access to your markets as leverage to get them to do things they might not otherwise want to do. To a lesser degree, there's what you would call soft power, which is kind of the attraction of society or social norms. You know, the United States has a lot of that because its society attracts a lot of people, certain types of people especially. People who don't like being restricted by certain conservative social norms, like if you're LGBT, or if you're in a country where there's a lot of ethnic tension. You might like coming to the United States, where where the government is relatively liberal in the classical sense, and I guess the American sense. And so there's a lot more tolerance of people, and there's much less internal domestic conflict as compared to certain other countries. And also, if you're a go-getter, if you like to work hard and you just want to try to get the most return for your hard work, the United States is innately attractive to a lot of those people. I'm not saying that there's not bullshit in the United States too. I'm saying there's relatively less bullshit in the United States than there is in other countries in terms of getting a job, working, etc. So America has soft power in that sense. It's attractive to people in that regard. And in so much as it is so, it not only attracts immigrants, high talent, very talented people, it also inspires people in other countries to try to implement reforms that try to mitigate traditional schisms in their own countries. Try to implement reforms that free up the economy, allow people to work harder without having to know somebody or have to pay somebody to get a job, or similar reforms that allow a more open political system, that more liberal in that sense, less repression, or that try to reduce ethnic conflict, or at least mitigate it. China's soft power is more, well, China doesn't have a lot of soft power, so maybe that's not a great example. there's some countries, there are some people that are attracted to China as a model of an alternative model to the kind of Washington Consensus, such as it was called. It was kind of a neoliberal economic development platform that tied together democratic and capitalist modes of development. But some people see the China model as an alternative, where you have a strong central government without elections or democracy, but strong markets. That's a whole other conversation, whether you can call China's markets strong. I don't know that that's a fair assessment, but certainly they're large and very important and very dynamic. It's opened up a lot of opportunities. So China's soft power in that sense is in its China model, so to speak. It's Beijing consensus, as some people call it. So all of those things lend diplomatic capital and lend power to a given country's negotiating position. Proximity helps too. Natural resources, for example, if you're a principal producer of a given natural resource, like say oil, that gives you relatively more diplomatic heft than you might otherwise, since you can basically throw the entire global economy into turmoil if it so pleases you. There's also just being next to an important trade route. So some country like say Singapore or Djibouti or etc. has relatively more diplomatic heft just because it's close to an important seaway, which countries want access to, and so then countries will negotiate with you for the right to station naval forces, or in the Djibouti's case, have an anti-piracy mission, something like that. So that also generates diplomatic capital, so to speak. Again, I'm not sure if this is what you were getting at with your question in terms of political strength. That's just I'm making some assumptions there. Could you please discuss Ho Chi Minh, his politics, and if there were lost opportunities by Ho Chi Minh due to the U.S.'s anti-communist, I assume you mean anti-communist policies? Yeah, there is this notion, because Ho Chi Minh did not start his Viet Minh nationalist movement in the 1950s during the Cold War or against the French. He actually started it in the World War II against the Japanese. Or at least that's when they started actively fighting the government. And the United States actually sent advisors, basically special forces advisors, to help Vietnamese nationalists fight the Japanese. So there actually were American advisors on the ground advising Ho Chi Minh in his guerrilla war against the Japanese during World War II. So there's this notion. Well, actually, I should explain further. Ho Chi Minh himself actually respected the United States a lot and revered the U.S. Constitution. He kind of wanted to use that as a model to develop his independent Vietnam. So based on that, there's this notion that if the United States had been more accepting of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, that a war would not have been as necessary. That maybe the United States and the Viet Minh could have been allies, and the whole Vietnam War could have been avoided. I don't think it was ever really likely, though, because the United States had a lot of difficult decisions to face early in the Cold War. And a lot of those decisions were basically a decision between doing the shitty thing and the shittier thing. So in the case of the Indochina War, which was the war France fought to maintain control over French Indochina, of which Vietnam was a part, that was a very significant political issue within France. And at that time, in the early 1950s, French politics was in a state of turmoil because the French economy was just a catastrophe after the war. And so a lot of people were very upset. There was a lot of discontent. There was a lot of dislocation. And that empowered a lot of radical political elements, specifically communists. So there was a real fear on the part of the United States and the rest of the West that the French government would succumb. Basically, that the communists would win pre-elections, take power, and shift France into the communist camp in the Cold War. Now, in general, the United States was a anti-imperial power. There was a lot of anti-imperialist sentiment in the United States, and people here were very critical of imperial powers, European powers specifically. And there was an impulse to kind of criticize the French and their effort in Indochina. But the trouble was, in French politics, a lot of French nationalists really hated the idea of losing the French Empire. And a lot of those people really hated, well, a lot of those same people really hated communists. So out of an interest of preventing the communists from taking power, there was desire to try to empower the French right wing. And part of that involved propping up their war effort in Indochina to try to make sure they remained more popular than the communists. And that was not like an ideal solution, but again, France was considered a lot more valuable than Indochina. And that's, not a stretch, considering how important France is in Western Europe. So, to a degree, you could say that the United States sacrificed Indochina in exchange for keeping France in the Western camp. It's debatable not the degree to which that was necessary or useful, the degree to which it worked, so to speak. But, there was a lot of uncertainty early in the Cold War, which I think a lot of people don't give American and Soviet policymakers credit for. It's easy with hindsight to make judgments, but given the sheer degree of uncertainty, you have to give them some credit for doing as well as they did. So in the case of the United States, alienating the Vietnamese was kind of part of the natural cost of maintaining America's position in Western Europe. And I don't think the United States would ever reverse that trade. I think, given the degree of uncertainty, it was considered a very smart. And in that sense, I don't think there was any great lost opportunity in that sense. I think if you had made more explicit what would have happened by alienating the Viet Minh and embracing the French, two policymakers at the time, they probably would have still gone the route they went. Because again, even now, there's no way to know for sure if the communists would have won if the right wing had become sufficiently unpopular, in part because of losing the empire. Keep in mind, French Empire was very much a big issue, not just in Indochina. The French were also fighting an insurgency in Algeria at that time. And that was the famous Battle of Algiers. So maintaining the empire was a very real question, and was very relevant to a lot of French conservatives especially. Actually, some interesting trivia I read a while back. French communists and their sort of, fellow travelers, whatever you want to call them, their other allied political elements, were not entirely sure they wanted to leave Indochina, whether or not they really wanted to give up the French Empire, which you'd think they would, being communists and being very critical of empire. But the reason that they weren't sure whether or not it was a good idea is because they thought that they were on the verge of taking power in France. And if they can take power in France, then that means they can extend communism not only to France, but also to any territories France controls. So if they can hold on to the French Empire long enough until they get into power, then they could extend communism not only to France, but also to those imperial holdings. So there was a sense then that maybe it would be a better idea to just kind of hang on until things pan out, so that if they do take power, then they can impose communism to a broader swath of territory, rather than just France. Let's see. There's probably more to that than what I said, but I'm not an expert. That's off the top of my head. For deeper reading, you'd have to go with a more informed source than me. Which aspect of Harvey's destruction do you think will have the lasting impact? Do you think it may change minds about climate change? Lasting impact. I don't know how much of a lasting impact it would really have. Because it's different than New Orleans, because New Orleans was kind of a giant tourist trap. Its economy was limited, shall we say. So when Hurricane Katrina wiped out the tourist trade, basically, in New Orleans, that decimated a good chunk of the economy. And it hasn't quite yet recovered. But Houston is different. Houston's economy is predicated on the oil industry, predominantly, among other things. So there's a lot of money in Houston. And as a result, I think they're going to have a lot of money with which to rebuild. Even in New Orleans, I think they have some refineries in New Orleans. Those refineries were up and running again only a few weeks after Katrina hit. So the core economic driver of a given community will power its recovery. the few refineries in New Orleans were not enough to power that recovery. Once the people were gone, tourism tailed off, and that really dealt a hammer blow, long-term blow. But in Houston, the economy is so much larger and so much more powerful, so much more dynamic and diverse, that it's probably, once it gets going again, it's going to generate a lot of money that can be used for relief efforts. And I'm sure the federal government and the state government will have a big role to play too. So that's even more resources that can get the city back up on its feet. I haven't read too deeply into the damage done by Hurricane Harvey on Houston, so there may well be some long-term damage that I don't know, some aspect that I haven't read about yet. But in general, Houston is so well off in natural disasters, the damage tends to be relatively short-term, short to medium-term anyway. It may take a while to rebuild residential areas in certain communities. In that regard, the damage could be long-term. But overall, I don't think the impact will be too great on Houston as a whole. I think the city will probably get back on its feet within the year. As far as climate change, I don't think it'll matter as far as who believes in climate change or not, one way or the other. I don't think extreme climate events really change minds, so to speak. I mean, all the people who believe in climate change and all that, as soon as the hurricane, whenever they see the big they don't need events like this in order to affirm their belief. They already believe in it. The people who don't believe in it generally are critical to begin with and aren't going to be swayed by an event like it. Would probably take a whole shit ton of extreme weather events like that in order to start swaying those people. I think you need some really serious, obvious, blazingly obvious evidence to really convert those people. So in that sense, I don't think Hurricane Harvey is going to change any minds. All the people who believe or don't believe in climate change are still going to believe that after this hurricane. Thoughts on the idea that the U.S. Supreme Court is designed to be and/or is becoming an oligarchy, one that creates undefeatable legislation rather than interpreting the Constitution? I disagree with that idea, and my disagreement, I'm no legal expert, definitely not that, but based on what I've read about the Supreme Court as an institution, if not the judicial system in the United States in general as an institution, is that the Supreme Court kind of has an undeserved reputation as being domineering, that it has an illegitimate amount of power, and that its power is growing. And I think part of that comes out of the partisan divide in the United States. From what I've read anyway, the assertion is that the Supreme Court is not becoming more partisan. And in fact, over the past half century, it's actually been getting less partisan. It's actually becoming more professional. The problem is more the perception that it's partisan. More and more people seem to think that the Supreme Court is an explicitly partisan institution. And they focus more and more on who's conservative and there are justices on the Supreme Court who vote kind of along those lines. But the frequency with which they're even able to do that is relatively little. The vast majority of Supreme Court decisions are not close. They're not partisan. Most Supreme Court decisions have most of the justices voting for a given decision, with maybe a couple of dissenters. The cases where there's a clear divide between liberal and conservative judges, if you want to call them that, that's probably not an accurate legal description from a technical perspective. But the cases where they're divided very evenly along those lines are very rare. And generally, when they do rule on cases like that, they rule in a way that kicks the decision back to Congress or some such. It's pretty rare that they rule explicitly in a way that creates new legislation or some equivalent thereof that basically amounts to an abuse of their power. And I would further add that the most powerful branch of the U.S. government is still and remains Congress. And if the judiciary did pass a law, or not pass a law, if the judiciary interpreted a law, ruled in a way that interpreted a law in a certain way that went against the wishes of Congress, Congress has all the power in the world to just go and change that right away. They can very easily say, oh, fuck that. Boom, undone, easy. All they have to do is pass a new law. The Supreme Court doesn't have all that much power in that regard. So I don't think it's becoming an oligarchy. I have heard criticism, and I actually know a guy from India who was pretty surprised by it, that Supreme Court justices are appointed for lifetime terms, which is a little iffy because that kind of there's an incentive problem there, a principal agent problem, a kind of moral hazard, if you will, where they can once they're appointed, they can kind of do whatever they want. It's not really true that they can do whatever they want once they're appointed, though, because they can be removed if there's malfeasance. And again, the people who get nominated are generally pretty squeaky clean. You know, the nomination process has always been relatively difficult, but it's especially difficult now in a hyper-partisan political environment. So the amount of people that are getting nominated who are just explicitly partisan hacks, I don't think there really are any anymore. You know, a lot of the people are actually legitimately good lawyers. You know, they're good at their profession, and they're generally pretty good about being impartial. You'd have to go with somebody more informed about that issue than me to get more detail than that. There is a source, I would recommend Lawfare, which is a pretty good source on the legal side of American politics and the law as an institution in the United States. They generally do pretty good work from what little I've seen of them. I'm not a big legal guy, so I don't read a whole lot of it, but they come highly recommended to me. And so I pass that on to you, the listener. Have you heard anything about the possible threat of Russia's and Belarus army training Zapad 2017 for some Eastern European countries? Do you think that is just fear-mongering, or can it be a real concern? There we go. It can be a real concern. I don't think it's a real concern. I don't think it's a big deal, because Russia and Belarus have those exercises, I think, every year. Zapad might be abnormally large, because I know Russia's deploying relatively more troops than it has before, but I don't think a military exercise is going to really... It's a somewhat threatening signal, but I don't think it signals anything in terms of, like, they're going to invade or they're going to do something. I think it's just a show of force, a show of strength, if you will. North Korea complains incessantly about annual exercises that South Korea and the United States have, and the United States never has any interest in invading North Korea, or etc. It's just a show of force and, also just an exercise. Exercises have a lot of value. You don't do them arbitrarily. You do them because you want to train your people. Training is very, very important. One of the big advantages the United States military has over peer militaries is that it does train its people so much. You know, it's very expensive to train people well, so that's no small thing, and it makes a big difference. You know, as the old saying goes, the more you sweat on the training field, the less you bleed on the battlefield. So exercises, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and sometimes military exercises are just military exercises. Is it fear-mongering? To a degree, but I don't think it's any more the degree of fear-mongering that I would expect from people who are very concerned about Russia in general. I have a sneaking suspicion this person might be from Poland, because I would expect Poles in particular to be concerned about this, given the given the pathology Poles have towards Russia. So I wouldn't worry about it. If you're Polish or some other Eastern European person, I wouldn't worry about the exercise too much. It probably is partly directed at you. It probably is kind of made to intimidate Eastern European nations a bit. But beyond that, I don't think it's a signal of any wider ill intent on the part of Russia. Now, there's more questions, but I had a question of my own that I wanted to ask chat, because I know we had some Brazilian listeners for a while. And so I wanted to ask, because we had I guess it was a month or so ago, that we were talking about President Temer and how he is pushing forward a significant reform program of economic reforms in Brazil. And my impression of him was that he was a kind of that he was implementing all of these reforms even though he knew they were wildly unpopular and knew he would not be able to get reelected passing them. And that he was basically just taking the opportunity presented by the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff to try to push through a lot of economic reforms that have kind of been stuck on the back burner in Brazil for a long time. That had been my impression, but somebody in chat had mentioned, again, like a month ago, that he was actually doing it to avoid impeachment himself. That, apparently Brazilian politics is very impeach-happy. Almost every Brazilian president since 1985 has apparently been subject to impeachment proceedings. So apparently this guy had argued that Temer, in order to avoid impeachment, had made a deal with his political opponents to pass these reforms in order to avoid impeachment. And I wasn't able to follow up on that. I wasn't able to, what little reading I did on it didn't reveal much. So I wanted to ask chat, and specifically Brazilians in chat, if there are any, whether or not that's true, the degree to which that's true.
Where are the Brazilians at?
Yeah, I don't read chat generally during the while we do this, but I do read it afterwards to try to gauge feedback. So if you want to post that, I would thank you very much. I would be very for any feedback on that point. So let's see, there was so the next question was, growing up I've always associated liberalism, humanity, / acceptance of change / compassion for others, yet rationally I know that extremists on any side can be bad. What is your personal definition of a quote-unquote liberal, and what it means to you, and when do you think conservatism is a good thing? So liberalism is about humanity and acceptance of change and compassion for others. That's all part of liberalism. Again, classical liberalism. Conservatism, I'm going to make an assumption here and assume that this person is American and is talking from the perspective of American politics. So here in the United States, liberal means your political left and conservative means your political right. I would point out here that everybody in the United States is liberal in a classical sense. Liberalism is basically the state ideology, the state religion of the United States. All of the institutions were built by liberals along liberal lines. So everybody, conservative and leftist in the United States, is fundamentally liberal in that sense. The differences are kind of details, in terms of what kind of liberalism, the scope of government, how big can the government get before it becomes threatening, etc. Things like that. Very liberal arguments, I might add. The debates we have here in the United States are very much couched in liberal ideology and liberal discussion, liberal philosophy. So if you're asking in terms of when can conservatism be a good thing, in that sense the question kind of implies that conservatism is not itself liberal, is not itself concerned with humanity, acceptance of change, compassion for others. Conservative liberalism in the United States is concerned with those things. I would argue, this is my perspective. It just approaches them from a different perspective. And, we could get into the differences between, left and right in the United States and some of the implicit assumptions that kind of form the basis for their disagreement and the hyper-partisanship here. Confirmed from the USA. Thank you, PactFact. So in that sense, conservatism is no great evil when it's done right. But both leftist ideologies and rightist ideologies can be done wrong, and so in that sense, leftist ideologies have no great advantage in that sense. I'll kind of leave it at that, because I think that kind of addresses it roughly. But if you want more elaboration, please do post, because it's an interesting topic of discussion, and we can get more into it.
One of the general recommendations that I usually talk about when elections are coming up and people are asking, who are you voting for, what's good to focus on with an election, doing a little bit of research on the candidates is really valuable, because corruption isn't necessarily 100% represented in the party that you think it is. People tend to have a leaning left or right when they're moving into elections, but if you have someone who's a really bad track record who's in your party, usually it's wise to either not vote for them or vote against them. Maybe vote for independent or sometimes even the opposing party if you feel like you have a little bit more common ground with them, bearing in mind who the better public servant is, because ultimately that is the goal. If you're working in government, then your goal is governance, and certain people are better at governance than others. It's not universal that one party is going to be better than another, at least in the historical American context.
Yeah, political parties in the United States are relatively weak compared to political parties in other countries. They're very decentralized, and part of that is spatial. Just the United States is so damn huge, it's hard to coordinate all of them. but that's also institutional. It's the way the government is structured. We don't have a proportional parliamentary system here. It's very much first past the post, as the British call it. And that lends itself to a two-party system, and that is very open. We have open primaries here. It's very easy to run under a political party's banner without necessarily having that party's permission, especially at a local level. Yeah, that was kind of the dilemma faced by Republicans when Donald Trump was running. Because there was a lot of Republicans who supported Donald Trump, but there was also a lot of Republicans who really did not like what Trump stood for, or at least what he appeared to stand for while he was running for president. And those sort of traditional Republicans kind of faced a real dilemma because they didn't like Hillary Clinton, but they also didn't really like the direction that Donald Trump was taking the party. And so, what do you do? It was, I won't get too much into like all the different criticisms establishment conservatives have of Donald Trump and his flock, shall we say. But yeah, suffice it to say that there was a lot of angst on the part of traditional conservatives in the United States because Donald Trump was not seen as a traditional liberal. And again, that speaks to the predominance of liberalism in the United States among both ideologies, both political parties. The principal thing that upset people about Donald Trump on both left and right was that they kind of saw him as almost being illiberal, even if they didn't couch it in those terms. Again, the word liberal has kind of been poisoned by American partisan politics. But effectively, that's the root of the criticism of Donald Trump. He's not sufficiently liberal in the classical sense. Do you feel comfortable talking about the environment? Are humans a threat to their own survival on the planet? I'm comfortable talking about the environment. The problem is I don't know a whole lot about it. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about the science, so I don't really feel like, most of the stuff I talk about, even if I don't know a lot about it, I've read something about it, and I can kind of answer questions based on that, but with things like climate change and the environment, I haven't read nearly as much.
One of the things I was talking with PactFex about earlier today was with the whole climate science discussion in the US right now, one of the things that people don't tend to talk about is the difference between how the climate has changed historically and prehistorically, and how we've sort of exploded in our industry and our ability to shape our surroundings with technology. So we have orders of magnitude greater population than we did thousands of years ago, like way more people. And not just people, we have huge agricultural industries, tons of livestock, tons of vehicles that put off a lot of stuff. So we're not playing the same game anymore. It's a new game of how heavily we can influence the planet. It has its pluses and its minuses, so if we're gonna make big changes, we have to expect some pretty big consequences for our actions. People don't appreciate the scale. I guess that's the issue. They think of it as a yes-no of, is there climate change, is there not? It's about seeing the evolution of our impact on our surroundings over time. And part of that's to our credit of, we've advanced technologically, we've moved from using these basic fuels to more advanced fuels, we have more propulsion, we have more energy creation, we're evolving at a very rapid pace technologically speaking, so we need to see what the fallout is of that, like what other consequences are coming with this. And just look at the volume of garbage based on how much stuff we produce and throw away. It's unprecedented, basically, because we never mass-produced food in the sense that you have huge factories that just make shitloads of bread, more than we can possibly eat. There was a statistic recently of how much food India throws away on a regular basis, and people think of India as a country where a lot of people are starving. Sure, maybe that's the case, but we can produce so much pretty cheaply that we've kind of solved the problem of producing enough food and more of figuring out the distribution of it.
That's a much better answer than I could give.
Well,
Thank you, Neuro.
Yeah, with the Christianity stuff, there's some overlap between conservative Christians and denial of human-caused climate change. So those debates kind of go hand in hand. You have people like Bill Nye, the science guy, who will have a debate on evolution and then have a debate on climate science, kind of against the same people. So a lot of the people, if if you're batting for this team, then a lot of times it's likely that you also have this same notion, because we tend to form groups and tribes pretty well. That's one of our human natural tendencies.
Yeah, the only exposure I've had to it really, from an academic technical perspective, was there's a blog I read, frequently anyway, called Fabius Maximus. And I'm not endorsing what's written on Fabius Maximus, I'm just saying that's one possible source of information you can go to for information. And it's one of the many that I use. And sometimes they write about it, the bloggers there write about it. And I think they fall... Their argument is that there definitely is climate change. The question is, to what degree do people contribute to that? That speaks to what you just said. You basically just elaborated that. And then the other thing they talk about, the IPC, they say that people don't pay enough attention to the IPC because apparently there's some criticism that they're too conservative in their estimates. They're also, those bloggers, again, I don't know enough about the issue to have my own opinion, so I'm leaning on this blog that I read. They also say that, how do I put it? The people who are very much wanting people and society to do something about climate change, their political tactics to try to get their preferences realized in policy are too alarmist. They're too exaggerated, and it ends up discrediting them to a degree. And after a while, people start to wonder whether or not it's actually true because they see that things are exaggerated so much.
I think
again, that's their criticism.
One of the biggest issues is the difference between a linear progression and a logarithmic progression on any given front, and how it's not exactly intuitive. If you think about how human intuition developed by evolutionary psychology, it doesn't really make sense for us to think about things in terms of the size of how much water's in the ocean or how much garbage is produced in 2017. Like, those are volumes that we would never have to deal with for the vast majority of our species' existence. So if you're trying to make an argument that climate change is real and it's going to be a big crisis, it's really hard to put it in terms that we can intuitively understand. Which is why a lot of people will dismiss it. They'll be like, oh yeah, you say there's a big problem, but my yard is clean. And the weather's been mostly the same, maybe it's a couple degrees warmer, but it's about how quickly we're accelerating our output of fuel and garbage and all this sort of thing. And if those trends continue, then the problem's going to get very, very large, very, very fast. But it's like I said before, it's unprecedented. We have no former example of, oh yeah, this happened in the 60s and it's going to happen again, so buckle up. It's like, this is a new problem that we're being faced with, and I can't exactly describe it in medium-sized terms that humans tend to think of, in terms of like fives or tens or hundreds. This is like millions and billions of volumes of garbage and impact on the planet. We're risen apes, not fallen angels. If that's your secular narrative.
That sounds about right. Thank you. That's much better, much more information than I have.
You run into similar problems when you're trying to study quantum mechanics. That's another frontier that really betrays human intuition, where if you want to be successful at quantum mechanics, you can't really go with what you would expect to follow. There are a lot of unexpected things that you kind of just have to manually train yourself to work with.
Hello?
Hello.
Oh, sounded like your mic cut out there.
Oh. Evolutionary psychology. So, for a brief aside on what that is, you're talking about the forces that led to humans as they are, if you believe that humans exist now by the process of evolution by natural selection. So what does nature select? Nature selects things that can reproduce fast enough that their population grows over time rather than decreases over time and they become extinct. So the brain and the body have to be energy efficient machines that propagate the species. So the way that our brains function intelligence is obviously an attribute, but it's going to be based on how well it will allow us to increase the size of our tribe, which is a fairly simple goal. We have a lot of really cool advanced stuff that comes with human psychology, but ultimately, can you fuck enough and like keep your offspring alive enough that your tribe propagates itself and you continue to survive? You're going to contribute more to the gene pool, and the species is going to reflect those successful cases rather than the less successful cases where people die young or make bad decisions or get chased down and that sort of thing. So one of the things that we kind of forget is we've had some measure of civilization for so many thousands of years that it's not in the collective memory of what humanity was like in the state of nature, where evolutionary psychology was kind of the direct motivating factor for how we thought about stuff. We have new systems that have never existed before. Like, we're all hanging out around a Twitch stream. Like, what the fuck is that even supposed to be? We're all around the world right now, so there's a technology that's allowing us to communicate over a great space. We have no risk tomorrow morning that our neighbors are going to come kick down our door and shoot us with bows and arrows. Like, that's a new thing, that you're not going to die when you go out to take a piss in the morning. That used to be standard. So that context of where we came from in the state of nature has been mostly lost. You would have to do reading about what your 24-hour day would look like back in those times, or do some study of maybe one of the uncontacted tribes in the Amazon where they still live largely in that context. Evolutionary psychology makes way more sense if you see that as the ground floor of the game, whereas now we have institutions and governments and nations, very large-scale things that never existed before.
Well, I hate to transition out of that because it's a very interesting topic. But there was another question here. Do you think there'll be a second scramble for Africa between China and the USA? I don't. For anybody who doesn't know what the scramble for Africa was, that was a period in the late 1800s in which the parts of Africa that had not been claimed by colonial European powers were parceled out between them in I think it was the Treaty of Berlin or some such thing. And a good chunk of Africa, probably vast majority of it, had not been colonized up until that point, because a lot of it was deep in the interior, away, not easily accessible. And a lot of European countries were not that interested. But imperialism kind of became an ends unto itself in the late 1800s. And thus, European powers made a big push to kind of carve up what was left of Africa. I don't think that China and the United States are going to compete hard for Africa in even a metaphorical sense in that regard. I don't think they're going to compete hard for special privileges or rights there. You know, the United States and China have very large economies, but they're also kind of different. You know, China is a mass producer of low-end goods. They're working on transitioning to producing higher-end goods, but that's kind of still a work in progress. We can talk later if somebody's interested about how China's trying to change its economy, because that's actually a significant historical event ongoing right now. But anyway, they're kind of competing for different markets. You know, China's kind of got to the low end of the market, the United States has the high end. The United States produces a lot of heavy machinery and things like that, and China produces, you know, other things. And also, China is a lot better at actually getting people on the ground. There's a lot of Chinese citizens who go to Africa just to trade, just to kind of be merchants. And that, you know, Americans don't really seem to do that much. I've heard of a few cases of it, but it doesn't seem to be at nearly the same scale as Chinese migrants moving to China to take advantage of economic opportunities there. Most of the American presence in Africa seems to be more corporate, for large-scale projects and things like that. Yeah, there's not. I mean, it just kind of depends on what you mean by scramble. You know, what would a modern scramble for Africa look like? You know, I mean, I guess you could say competing for market share, but again, they're not really competing in the same goods. I guess you could say that they could go to a country and ask them for preferential trade treatment, but in the modern liberal international regime, it's frowned upon to give preferential trade treatment to some countries over others. That's actually considered discriminatory. And in most cases, that's illegal, except under special circumstances. So I'm not real sure what they would compete for. I've read headlines about it, talk about how China or Japan buys large tracts of land in Africa, and how it's like a new imperialism, but that's not really accurate either, because it's not the Chinese government or the Japanese government that buys that land. It's actually just companies, generally food companies, that want another source of agricultural produce. And so that's just diversification, you know, trying to get land that has a quality or that can grow things that you can't back home. Or maybe having land that's closer to an end market that you want to expand to. Something like that, above and beyond some strategic consideration, some desire to have some strategic control over land in Africa so that you can exert influence. That's not quite an accurate representation. It's much, thus far, most of the interaction between China and obviously the United States has mostly been commercial, much more so than anything political. And I think I said before that the Communist Party of China isn't all that interested in stuff going on outside China. You know, they're kept quite busy by 1 billion plus Chinese in China. So they're not really interested in going and having some big adventure in Africa. For them, just having good relations with African states such that Chinese can go there and make money, and that China can have productive trade relations with those countries. That's pretty much the extent of China's ambition there. So short answer, no. I don't think there will be a second scramble for Africa. Let's see. Considering it took 50 years to graduate from black men voting to women voting, do you think that Hillary's gender had a big impact for voters on the election if all other factors were equal?
That's the problem, is the other factors weren't equal.
Yeah, that's the trouble. It was not a woman running for president. It was Hillary Clinton running for president.
Well,
and if you're American,
she is a woman, but she has tons of political history, I think, is the issue. And
yeah, that's the thing. If you're American, you know the meaning of that. But if you're not American, just understand that Hillary Clinton basically has her own brand. You know, she very much is her own entity, above and beyond being a woman running for president or a Democrat running for president. She is Hillary Clinton running for president. And nobody else has that level of brand recognition, at least not among the Democrats anyway. So in that sense, yeah, definitely not ceteris paribus. Not all else was equal. I think her political brand easily swamped any effect her gender would have one way or the other. So I don't think it was a big consideration in that regard. Actually blew through questions. That's okay, I've got a lot of other stuff to talk about if anybody's interested. Yeah, every week I make a list of topics to talk about, you know, just in case there's not enough questions or just to kind of fill, you know, gaps. And we never have enough time to go over all of them, so they just keep building up. But I thought it was interesting that the Saudis have kind of started a kind of entente with Iraq, because after the United States invaded Iraq and overthrew the government, the Saudis were very paranoid about the Iraqi government afterward being controlled by mostly Shia political groups. And the fear by the Saudi government was that the Shia political groups in question had strong ties with Iran, which they did, and the inference the Saudis made was that they must then be puppets of Iran, which is not quite as accurate. But the strong ties were more than enough to put off the Saudis, and so the Saudis have not normalized relations with Iraq ever since. And we've talked before about how the Middle East and a lot of the Middle East right now can be defined as a Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So any country that's too friendly with Iran automatically becomes a target, basically. It has a target on its back as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned. Couldn't do as much about Iraq, given the power that Shia political forces have in Iraq, but the Saudis did do what they could to kind of undermine them in little ways, and at the very least diplomatically isolated them. But now that's started to change. They've started to kind of engage more with the Iraqi political actors, and relations have started to warm. And that's a really encouraging sign as far as Iraq goes and reconciliation between Sunnis and Shias. Certainly anything that would, well, for one, it encourages the Sunni Arab population in Iraq. It makes them feel like they have a backer, where before the Saudis kind of didn't seem to care as much. So they'll feel more comfortable and safe, which would make the reconciliation process more productive. But for the Shia political groups too, it's encouraging because it would make them less paranoid and less reliant on Iran. You know, to a degree, the Saudi paranoia about Iraqi political groups became a self-fulfilling prophecy, because in order to, you know, they needed support, international support, and they weren't getting it from the Saudis, so they might as well get it from the Iranians. Yeah, there was a bunch of visits by political actors to Saudi Arabia in late July. A bunch of political figures, and in particular, notably, Muqtada al-Sadr, whom, if you're American, you may remember was a leader of an anti-American Shia militia in Iraq that the United States military fought a number of battles with. So he's especially considered dangerous in terms of ties to Iran. But the fact that the Saudis even talked to him and invited him to Saudi Arabia, that shows the depth that the Saudis are willing to go in pursuit of warmer relations with Iraq. Yeah, and the Iraqi elections are coming up, so the timing was very effective, very well chosen. So the effect could be that Iranian influence is lessened. It could mitigate the power and influence of popular mobilization militias in Iraq, which are the sort of Shia militias that were deployed to help fight IS, because the Iraqi military was not quite large enough to handle it on their own. The militias are seen as being tied to Iran and Iranian interests. So if those militias can be pared back, that would be good for reconciliation in Iraq, because the Sunni Arab population fears them. It sees them as being violent acolytes of a highly partisan form of Shia politics. And then it could, again, obviously, it could improve the chances of reconciliation between Shias and Sunnis. So those are kind of the three big implications there. So that's, in a region beset by violence and bad news, that was some good news. That's an encouraging trend. I also noted that Kenya's election commission overruled their recent election. There was an election just recently, yeah, and there was fraud alleged by the opposition. And normally in Africa, that whenever the opposition alleges fraud in an election, they lose, which is always pretty much. The Electoral Commission looks into it and says, yeah, not enough corruption to overthrow the election, no big deal. But in Kenya, the Electoral Commission actually did overthrow the result of the election and have mandated that there should be another election. And I think that's the first time in Africa's modern history that's happened. So on the one hand, that shows the maturity and independence of Kenya's judicial system. That's an impressive feat, because one of the big criticisms of African institutions in general is that they're weak. But in Kenya, apparently sufficiently strong to go against the powers that be, such as they are. And it was especially, one thing I noted, and I didn't really follow up on it, but it was especially weird because there were election observers in Kenya who had stated that the election had been free and fair. So it's very unusual for election observers, international observers, to assert a free and fair election, and then to have that government itself recognize, oh wait, yeah, no, totally not free and fair. It kind of brings into question the credibility of international observers. So let's see. Oh, a correction from last week. I said that the Nizam of Hyderabad had wanted to join Pakistan, but was prevented from doing so by India. Not quite. Actually, he originally wanted to join Pakistan, but was then talked out of it by Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, the last British Viceroy of India. And so then the Nizam of Hyderabad wanted to be an independent country, which was one of the options available to princely states in British India. But then, because of political violence and machinations by the Indian government, the territory ended up getting annexed to India. So that's a correction for last week, a little more detail. I also thought, so something else that happened last week, you know, France has been getting into this big liberalization reform movement, basically, with the new Macron government. And that's a whole, I have like a whole page of notes about French labor reform, but I won't get into that unless somebody wants to. But more interesting, I thought, was a dispute between European countries, France among them. There are apparently these things called Posted Workers Directive. It's called the EU's Posted Workers Directive. And it allows basically labor firms that contract out labor, to get hired for a job in, say, France or Germany, and then to hire workers in their home country. So like a Polish labor firm can get a contract in France and they can take their Polish workers with them to work the job. And the reason it's controversial is because the benefits payments, the taxes basically that they pay, is in accordance with their home country, in this example Poland, instead of to France. And so the criticism is that this disincentivizes hiring French workers in favor of workers from low-cost labor countries, and creates a kind of downward spiral, a race to the bottom in welfare benefits, because it's cheaper to pay for a worker from an Eastern European country where the benefits requirements for workers are less. You don't have to pay as much into, Social Security, whatever the equivalent is of Social Security is over there, and other such benefits and taxes as you do in Western Europe. So Western European countries are very critical of this workers' directive and want some kind of reform to kind of even things out so that their workers are not put at a disadvantage because they have a larger welfare state compared to Eastern Europe. And so Macron in France, I'm probably mispronouncing his name again, but the French government and then certain other governments, Austria's government, for example, have all been supportive for that measure. And then Poland and Hungary, obviously, no surprise, are very resistant. And then some other countries are kind of on the fence. Romania, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, from what I read, are nominally supportive, but have caveats. They do want protections for their workers. So that's an interesting intra-EU dispute. And kind of how that gets resolved is going to say something about how the EU evolves going forward. Because one of the big questions in the European Union is how much centralization should there be? And right now the consensus seems to be a multi-track approach where different countries can integrate with each other to different degrees depending on their individual preferences. And so this is kind of a test case of that. To what degree do you want to economically integrate? Well, it may be that some countries prefer to block labor from other countries to some degree. Let me see. So then in Thailand, Yingluck Shinawatra didn't show up to her court case, which was a little weird. And she didn't disappear, she ran. She basically is out of the country. But it seemed like kind of I don't know, it's not a very politically savvy move. You'd think she would at least release a statement first or something to kind of lay the groundwork for fleeing the country, but she didn't. Yeah, if you're not, for those not familiar with the Shinawatra saga in Thailand, Thaksin Shinawatra was a wealthy businessman in Thailand who became involved in politics and got to be very popular by way of his populist policies, which generally involved giving lots of benefits and supports to people living in rural areas, agricultural workers, farmers, what have you, whom had traditionally been kind of marginalized by urban elites who had traditionally ran the country. And that worked for a while, but the fact that Thaksin was so popular really rankled the traditional political elites in Thailand, who again were more urban and were entrenched in the government, the institutions of government, the judicial and the military institutions. And after a while, they became sufficiently suspicious of his motives and power that they basically drove him out of the country on corruption charges, which were probably accurate, and they were probably fair. You know, Thai politics is fairly corrupt. But they went after him in particular, and he had to leave the country. And so instead of giving up politics, though, his political party continued to exist, and in his stead, his sister, Yingluck Shinawatra, ran for office in his place and won. Because again, his populist policies were very popular with big swaths of the population. And so that created a situation where there was even more tension, because Yingluck introduced a lot of even more policies that were very populist, and that put even more of a financial burden on the government. And the most controversial of those was a rice subsidy scheme, in which the government bought rice from farmers at a higher price than market price, and then turned around and would sell it to market. The whole program was a catastrophe, and the government lost huge amounts of money. I mean, huge amounts of rice were just never sold, were never moved. And it introduced a huge burden on the government. And so, as a result of because of that clusterfuck, all of the political opponents of Shinawatra hit the streets in mass protest. And you might remember the mass protest in Thailand, hearing about that in the news from a few years ago. It got to be a pretty regular thing. And it just about shut down the country's tourist economy, which is very important to Thailand. And so eventually, finally, because no consensus, no compromise could be met between the red shirts and the yellow shirts were sort of the urban pro-monarchy people who were opposed to Shinawatra, and then the red shirts were the populists who were voting for Shinawatra. And there was no compromise. The country was just constantly in protest and in a state of upheaval. So finally, the military intervened. This was a few years ago, and basically just ended democracy in Thailand. Temporarily, so they said. It's not unusual for the Thai military to stage coups. They coup even more often than Turkey has, and Turkey's couped a fair amount in its time. So, as a result, after the aftermath of that coup is that Yingluck Shinawatra was brought to trial on charges of basically gross corruption and negligence, etc. And her supporters were dead set against it, wanted to protest for her, but the military government has been very adamant about clamping down on unrest and political expression critical of the military government. And as a result, the trial has gone forward pretty much unabated. The military government says it's going to have elections soon, but it hasn't happened yet, really. And the constitution they wrote gives them disproportionate power in Thailand, so it seems now like a power grab on the part of the military. Whether or not real democracy and a fair constitution will ever, return to Thailand is kind of an open debate right now. But more to the point, specifically to Yingluck Shinawatra, her trial date came up, and rather than show up, she just disappeared. She never showed up, and apparently she's just fled the country, fearing what she perceives to be unfair political charges, a political witch hunt, if you will. Yeah, Thai politics are interesting. We could talk more about that if somebody wants to, because there's that divide there, and the characteristics of the respective political groups are interesting.
We can hit that pretty hard next week. We're about out of time this week. Maybe one more short question, I think.
Short question. Oh, yeah, we had one more. I assume he's talked about Brexit before, but has he talked about what the EU can do to mitigate it? Brexit is an interesting topic. I've got a whole bunch of notes on it. I keep adding to the notes as I read more about Brexit and the negotiations therein. The thing the EU can do is just to be difficult, because it has the leverage in the negotiations. The EU single market is a lot larger than the British market. So the British would get a lot more from having access to that market than the Europeans would have from having access to the British market. So innately, they kind of have the leverage there. And one of the things they're doing is that they're dragging their feet on negotiations. They're trying to force Britain to compromise on this Brexit bill. Part of the negotiation. There's a lot of different things they have to negotiate, but the Brexit bill The European Union is pushing that as the first thing to be settled, and they don't want to negotiate on anything else until the Brexit bill is settled. And that's a problem for the British government because that's a very controversial thing. If you don't know what the Brexit bill is, basically the European Union has a set of charges that it wants Britain to pay as part of leaving the European Union related to certain financial obligations. So there are expenses the European has incurred either on behalf of the British or to the benefit of the British. And those expenses the European Union would still have to pay after the British leave the European Union, and it wants some recompensance from the British on that account. So the British are very reticent about paying back this because they just want to leave, or at least nominally that's what they're supposed to want. The British government is supposed to want that. So the European Union kind of puts them in a vice there. Because again, the British what they really want is clarity. Because right now there's a lot of uncertainty in the British economy stemming from what eventually Brexit will look like in the long term. And the more that uncertainty plays out, the more the British economy kind of suffers. And the less time there is to negotiate not only with the European Union, but also with other countries. Because the British, of course, have said they're going to make up for reduced access to the single market by negotiating free trade agreements with other countries. But other countries don't want to negotiate with Britain until they know what Brexit looks like, because they're more concerned with pissing off the European Union, because they want access to the European Union single market more than they want access to the British market. And so to avoid making an agreement with Britain that maybe upsets the European Union and puts access to that market in jeopardy, they're waiting to see what Brexit looks like before starting negotiations with Britain. So by dragging its feet, the European Union is putting a lot of pressure on Britain to basically give lots of concessions. And I don't think that's part of a grand conspiracy. I think they're just doing that to get the best deal they can. And again, they're in a good position to get a pretty good deal with all the leverage they have. But you could argue that they're trying to make Brexit as uncomfortable as possible, for one, to discourage other countries that might think of leaving the European Union. But also, two, because there's this sneaking suspicion, at least a hope on the part of some people who don't want Britain to leave the European Union, both in Britain and in Europe, that maybe the terms will be bad enough that people in Britain will ask for another referendum. Not a referendum on whether or not to leave the European Union, but a referendum on whether or not to accept the terms of that are the Brexit terms that are agreed to. And maybe if they disagree, if they vote against those terms, maybe they'll just give up the project entirely. You know, the idea being that, okay, we wanted Brexit, but if it's going to look like this, then don't bother. It's too costly. I think they're called the Liberal Democrats, a political party in Britain. That's basically their platform. They want to have a second referendum to verify whether or not the public accepts Brexit, and if it doesn't accept the Brexit deal that's eventually negotiated, then they should just abandon the whole project. That's kind of the Liberal Democrat. The thing is, Liberal Democrats are not like a very powerful political party in Britain. I don't think any other major political party has that stance. But you could argue that the Europeans and perhaps their British sympathizers kind of have that in mind as a sort of long game. So is that it? Are we out of time?
Yep, pretty much. It's been really good, very active chat today, and really nice support for you. We got
thank you.
$80 this time for Agent Smith. Respect.
Oh, wow.
That's good
Much
stuff.
appreciated.
Yeah, it's been a good week. Maybe next week we can dive into Thailand politics a little bit. I'm interested in
that would be
as well.
fun.
The friend who actually got me into StarCraft 2 in the first place he's ethnically Chinese, he's nationally Thai American, and his parents were, I believe, yellow shirts, which is the more upper class, I think, faction in that. Yeah. So they were yellow shirts, and it's kind of interesting to know an American person who's attached to that theater, I guess, drama, you could say, in Thailand. But it's been awesome having you on.
Yeah, awesome being here. Thank you again for having me.
Sweet. Well, until next week, this has been another